Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and no, I'm not trying to sucker you guys into watching like a 3-hour long video about Starship manufacturers. This is valuable information I have collected over the years when I realized that, hey, the galaxy's a tough place, and hauling around Ewok carcasses is only going to be good for so long before you start getting tired of the smell. And so I looked for financial stability in Star Wars, and I found it through the Galactic Stock Exchange. I like researching things, I like researching companies, and I like Starship. So I combined everything together, and this is kind of all of that research collected into one place. This is all the knowledge I have about the good companies, the bad companies, what you should watch out for, what you should try to stay away from. Well, I should be selling this in like some kind of course, but I'm not a scumbag. Well, I'm not a huge scumbag. So enjoy this, and I'll see you at the end of this. This is the story of Sienar Fleet Systems, the designer and manufacturer of the iconic TIE fighter line. Now, most people are familiar with the massive corporation that Sienar Fleet Systems would one day become, working alongside the Empire, but what a lot of people forget is that in the late Republic period, Sienar Technologies, as it was known during that period of time, was a middle-sized Starship manufacturing company which had been struggling in the last few centuries and was very much on a downwards trajectory. During the Old Republic era, they had been quite a formidable shipbuilding firm. They were responsible for the dreaded Interdictor-class cruiser more than 4,000 years earlier. In the years leading up to the Clone Wars, Sienar Technologies was struggling. They were mostly known for producing mundane landing craft and shuttles, stuff that just didn't excite shareholders at the quarterly financial reports. More importantly, these were very low-margin platforms that didn't do much to build the brand. If you wanted excitement at the time in the Starship manufacturing industry, head over to Slayn Korpil and their vertically integrated fuselages, or the newcomer in town Incom Corporation. Formerly known for repulsor lifts, they had now created a true classic in their first outing with the Z95 Headhunter. Sienar Technologies suffered from two things. One, it was truly an ancient corporation, as old as Kuat systems engineering almost. And so there was just a general lack of innovation and conservatism in the culture that prevented them from keeping up with their competitors. And two, instead of being professionally managed, this was a company that was not only owned by a family, it was also run by a family. Corporate nepotism at its worst. Being born into a rich family doesn't necessarily prepare you for running an intergalactic corporation like this one. And so centuries of missed opportunities, lack of innovation, just backwards thinking because of corporate nepotism meant that Sienar Technologies only existed because of the massive power and wealth it had acquired during the Old Republic period. And now those last bits of resources and capital were bleeding out onto the dirt-creep floors of their factories. There is really no future for this company at all. Now, in all fairness, the last 1,000 years or so have been rough for the entire Starship manufacturing industry. Limitations and sometimes outright bans on the construction of new capital ships and the demilitarization of the republics severely hurt companies like Sienar Technologies, and so when the Separatist crisis reached a boiling point and erupted into a massive war, while the rest of the galaxy was running around in fear and confusion, Sienar saw the lifeline that they desperately needed to basically pull themselves out of this hole and survive. But they ended up kind of messing up the entire situation, as we'll explain later on in this video. What's even stranger is, despite their mishaps during the Clone Wars, just a few years later, the company would rebrand itself as Sienar Fleet Systems, and it would win the Imperial Navy's lucrative multi-purpose starfighter contract, and suddenly, it'd become one of the largest shipbuilders not only in the galaxy, but probably in galactic history. It's clear in retrospect that Sienar Fleet Systems benefited more than any other firm from the rise of the Empire. But I guess the question I have for you guys today, and hopefully you'll have an answer for this by the end of the video, is what did the Empire get from Sienar Fleet Systems? A reliable line of fighters, an engineering marvel, or perhaps just one of the grossest examples of Imperial cronyism and corruption? Generally speaking, scions of extraordinarily wealthy families like the Sienars are pretty unremarkable. But that's just the stereotype, because every now and then a child is born with the right personality, with the right intelligence and motivations, that they can take full advantage of what their station in life can afford them. Born in 60 BBY to Naro Sienar, chief executive officer of the engineering firm known as Sienar Technologies, he would attend Rigovian Technical University, one of the finest engineering schools in the Old Republic. It was here that he developed an interest over failed engineering experiments after an assassin droid developed by one of his classmates murdered her. He wasn't necessarily affected by the death of one of his classmates. Instead, he was fascinated by the failures of her design. He would gather the droid and start a private collection of technological failures, a reminder perhaps of the danger of one's own hubris, and that the exhilarance of discovery should always be tempered by due diligence and the proper safety measures. This is a pretty profound thing for a young man to do. Wright Sienar was a very eccentric individual, but he also understood his own strengths at a very young age, and he also learned how to temper those strengths, which is, I think, a very rare kind of quality for a young person to have. In a lot of ways, this foreshadowed the brilliant but also meticulous engineer that he would one day become. When Wright Sienar graduated from university, instead of following in the footsteps of his father, he journeyed out into the world and sought to make a living on his own. He would start a scouting firm that mapped out and explored new hyperspace lanes, a job that was usually done by Jedi explorers and other types of wild men who loved exploration. The unknown region was perhaps one of the more dangerous areas that a young surveyor like him could travel to, and it was here that Wright Sienar would become independently wealthy.
It's not a liquid!
From selling survey information he had collected over the years. But once he returned to the family, instead of taking a cushy management job, Rafe decided to once again go out on his own terms, using fake identities this time to work at competing Starship manufacturing firms, including Corellian Incom Corporation, Bactoid Armor Workshop, Incom Corporation, and the Trade Federation. He also had an extended stay with the Shi'Char. This was an insectoid race that actually worshipped manufacturing custom starships. The Shi'Char would go on to found Hoersch Engineering. In those few years, Wright Sienar basically picked up insider knowledge and industry secrets from all of the major starship manufacturers in the galaxy, something that would take a normal individual probably decades to do. Some might call it industrial espionage. But once again, Wright Sienar wasn't really just interested in profits or destroying the competition. One could say that, like the Shi'Char, he had a fanatic love for building ships. And this is really who Wright Sienar was. He wasn't after the limelight, he wasn't after his father's position in the company. The only thing he was really interested in was just designing innovative and technologically advanced starships. And so his father recognized this in his son, and he would establish an internal workshop known as Sienar Design Systems within the company. And Wright Sienar would further create the secretive Advanced Projects Laboratory, which would be responsible for making some of the most cutting-edge designs in the entire starship manufacturing industry. In a lot of ways, Wright's operation sounds a lot like Lockheed Martin's Advanced Developmental Projects, aka Skunk Works. Chief Palpatine was not an industrialist. He wasn't a builder of things. He had very limited governing experience when he stepped into office and would oftentimes delegate these duties to others. Instead, he started his professional life in the Galactic Senate, and he rose to power not through legislating or championing certain ideologies. He was a deal broker, an organizer of such. Think Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell. Now, Chief Palpatine didn't desire the limelight initially. Instead, he worked patiently behind the scenes, collecting allies, creating partners, and basically building an unstoppable team for when he finally does try to take over the chancellorship position. What is it that Koensayr said about his own master, Darth Plagueis?
What kind of deal did you make with him?
I didn't. We didn't exactly. I just owe him. You know how he is. He collects people.
As a young man, Sheev was quite antisocial and problematic, but his master taught him to control his more psychotic urges and use his charm and charisma to build a network of people, collect them. Now, Palpatine would become quite skilled at identifying talented individuals with the skill sets that he needed. Individuals like the orphan Gallius Rax, whose undying loyalty would serve Palpatine well even after his death, or the exiled Chiss Commander Thrawn, whose strategic mind was second to none. He would be sent to the hottest trouble spots in the Empire during the Galactic Civil War. And then there was the young captain of the Outland Region Security Force, Wilhelm Tarkin, whose ambition and cruelty almost made him Sith-like. He would keep the rest in line. There was also the Jedi prodigy Anakin Skywalker, who would one day serve as a powerful enforcer and apprentice. And then there was Rafe Sienar, who also managed to catch the eye of Emperor Palpatine. Rafe Sienar in 39 BBY would meet a young Wilhuff Tarkin, who at the time was serving in the Republic Outland Region Security Forces still. The two would keep touch over the years, valuing each other's skills in their respective fields, and it was thanks to Tarkin that Sienar would land many important contracts with the Republic Navy. A few years later, disaster struck for Rafe Sienar. You remember the Shi'Char, those cultists who worshipped precision shipbuilding manufacturing? Well, they found out that Rafe Sienar was not actually a true believer, and so they sent assassins after him. Rafe would escape the assassination attempt, but his father would perish. The board of St. Sienar would quickly appoint Rafe Sienar as CEO in succession to his father. He was just in his early 20s at the time. By 32 BBY, most likely thanks to Tarkin, once again Darth Sidious would approach Sienar to build the Scimitar. That's the vessel that Darth Maul would use for many of his covert missions. The ship itself was based on designs of Darth Tenebrous, the master of Darth Plagueis. Tenebrous' public face, Rugus Gnome, was actually a well-known ship designer. The Scimitar courier vessel would feature a stygium crystal cloaking field which made it completely invisible to the naked eye. An extraordinary achievement that would rival Rafe Sienar's two other major accomplishments, the twin ion engine and also the interdiction machine. But when Maul was defeated on Naboo by Obi-Wan Kenobi, not only did he leave his torso behind, he also left his proprietary ship in one piece on that palace landing platform on Naboo. The ship would immediately be seized by Republic authorities, and investigators would later connect components in the ship to Sienar Saint Technologies, and Rafe Sienar was brought into the Senate for questioning. And although he would deny any connections to this mysterious ship, Rafe Sienar would still have to close down the design wing of his company, and he would have to lay low for quite some time. It also should be noted that several of the designers and engineers who worked on the Scimitar mysteriously ended up dead. We don't know if this is something Darth Sidious did, or this is just a darker side of Rafe Sienar's personality. Sienar would eventually re-emerge from the crisis by rebranding his company Republic Sienar Systems, and he would supply the Republic Navy with shuttles and transports. But RSS's most famous project was a prototype Corvette with the same stealth technology used on the Scimitar. This Corvette would be used during the Battle of Christophsis by Anakin Skywalker to bypass a Confederate blockade. Unfortunately, the construction and R&D cost of this project was simply too massive, and Republic Navy procurement balked at the enormous maintenance cost as well, and so only one unit was built. This was a massive blow to the company. Rafe Sienar was perhaps a bit too ambitious with this design. The stealth Corvette was far too ahead of its time, and he was unable to recoup any initial investment that the company placed into this platform. It was then discovered sometime in the middle of the war that Republic Sienar Systems, like many industrial manufacturing firms of this time, was selling components and actual starships to both sides of the conflict, and so they would be sanctioned by the Republic Senate. By the end of the Clone Wars, Republic Sienar Systems was completely bankrupt and owned by the Intergalactic Banking Clan. And after the crisis on Scipio, the IGBC was nationalized, and Republic Sienar Systems, along with all of its assets, were also nationalized. You know, Palpatine had a dream. You could say that he was a big Starship fiend. He liked to imagine a Star Destroyer hanging peacefully over every world controlled, a Stormtrooper battalion in every settlement, and an Imperial Governor in charge of every system. Like his political aspirations, Palpatine's economic policies were also driven by his massive insecurities and his desire to control every little detail within his empire, to everyone's detriment. But Palpatine had inherited the Republic's extremely weak financial situation that he created himself, and even with control of the IGBC, the largest banking system in the galaxy, and the establishment of his own Federal Reserve through the Imperial Central Bank, there was only so much that monetary policies could do to help the central government raise capital. With much of the galaxy in ruins, there was plenty of growth opportunity, plenty of people who needed jobs, plenty of cities to be rebuilt, but there just was no capital to do it with. Now, the printing of credits was definitely one solution, but print too many credits and you get hyperinflation, and that causes new problems on its own. And so as a result, Emperor Palpatine also focused on using the existing clone army to generate wealth. And the only way you use the military to generate wealth is by seizing things, and that's exactly what he did. Palpatine would strong-arm member planets and corporations either politically or with actual force to give up its resources and assets for the Empire. Thus began the complete nationalization of most major industrial, manufacturing, mining, and logistic companies in the galaxy. The industrial giants that backed the Separatist Alliance were nationalized. Even mid-sized manufacturing firms that were pretty dynamic and probably should have continued being privatized, like Incom Corporation, were nationalized. There were whispers also of Imperial correctional facilities being turned into labor camps. There were even accusations that the Empire was using slavery from worlds that resisted political transformation of the Republic. And thus began the very rapid and unnatural militarization of the Galactic Empire. Usually this type of ramping up of production at a national level was due to massive spending projects by the government, which usually ended up creating more jobs and boosting the manufacturing and industrial capacity galaxy-wide. But in this case, lacking capital, Palpatine just seized corporations, consolidated them, and then seized resources and manpower, and used essentially cheap and almost free resources and manpower. It's a very Sith-like thing to do, and in the long term, it's just not great for anyone involved. The general rule is free market economies will always outperform centrally controlled economies like the one that Palpatine controlled. But the Imperial economy was truly just focused on one thing, the development of a massive defense industry. Palpatine didn't care if everything else in the galaxy rotted and fell apart. And it's for this reason the Empire probably never could have lasted beyond 20 years anyway. The Galactic Civil War would have happened no matter what, because Palpatine's economic policies were so idiotic, destroyed the livelihoods and well-beings of so many average citizens in the galaxy that revolution was really the only course of action that they could take. Radicals, criminal elements, people living on the peripherals of society will always have problems with the institutions and governments that organize society. Alone, they really can't do much, but when the middle class, when the average person who's usually not very political, finds their life completely uprooted because of the policies and decisions of the central government, that is when an authoritarian state begins losing complete control of everything. Palpatine's military-industrial complex took everything from the people, resources, wealth, even the manpower necessary to prop up other industries as basic as, food services. But at least for a small moment in time, as messed up as it might seem, there was a miracle happening within the Starship manufacturing industry. And this was all centered around the newly created Sienar fleet systems, which Rafe Sienar was placed in charge of. You see, after the Scimitar Mall controversy, Rafe Sienar kept his head down and continued to work on various engineering projects, including refining the Scimitar's prototype twin-ion engine design. In many ways, this engine would become Rafe Sienar's magnus opus. Taking what he had learned from all his years working for various Starship manufacturers, along with the Scimitar's dedication to precision, the twin-ion engine was one of the most efficient engines ever designed. It had an extremely low heat profile, it could be charged in flight by solar panels, and most importantly, this engine contained no moving parts and therefore needed almost zero maintenance, which was a huge deal. Because for Palpatine's dream of one Star Destroyer for every planet, for every system to work, he also needed roughly 3 to 4 squadrons of TIE fighters on each one of these Star Destroyers, and as the Republic found out during the Clone Wars, Starship maintenance was extremely expensive and probably is what ultimately sank the Venator-class Star Destroyer carrier program. While smaller and less expensive than the massive Imperial-class battleships, the Venator's reliance on hundreds of small fighters for offensive-defensive purposes ultimately made this ship far too expensive for a peacetime Empire to operate. The TIE Fighter would completely change the game for the Empire, and at the core of the Empire's new low-cost, multi-purpose fighter platform was Rafe Sienar's revolutionary design, the twin-ion engine, the TIE and TIE Fighter. This, combined with the Empire's complete control over the supply chain, manpower, and resources needed to build the ship, along with massive scaling up of Starship manufacturing, meant that a single TIE Fighter, get this, cost only 60,000 credits. That was about a third of the price of the T-65B X-Wing, which is simply ridiculous. The TIE Fighter also featured some other interesting cost-saving measures. For instance, there were no deflector shields on this fighter. Instead, a tough spherical armored cockpit was built. This shows us the truth about the Empire. They had a lot of manpower. They trained some of the best pilots in the galaxy, and they were more than willing to throw them away. But when it came to resources and wealth, well, the Empire was quite poor, especially during this period. And thus, the TIE Fighter's kind of disposable design. The ship also featured a very powerful pair of LS-1 laser cannons. But unfortunately, they didn't have any ordnance launchers for proton torpedoes or concussion missile launchers, but I guess that's what a Star Destroyer's, 50 or 60 turbo lasers are for? In many ways, the TIE Fighter was completely different from all other starships on the market at the time. It had severe limitations that most ships did not, but for the purposes it was built for, short-range interception, very few ships could match the cost, quality, and performance of these ships. Which really makes sense, this design coming from Rafe Sienar, a man who always walked his own path in his life and, thought outside the box. There's no doubt that the TIE Fighter was an impressive feat, but as the Galactic Civil War kicked into full swing, its glaring weaknesses were exposed to the Rebel Alliance. While individual TIE Fighter pilots could keep up and oftentimes outmaneuver their Rebel foes, it was the lack of things like hyperdrives and shields that led to the Empire desperately looking to upgrade this platform to meet the new demands of the battlefield. One could argue that the TIE Fighter's short-range interceptor design was better suited for peacetime patrolling, rather than the actual battlefields of the Galactic Civil War. But even then, its limited range would decrease the Empire's influence in the galaxy and ability to patrol many systems. The entire situation could have been avoided had Emperor Palpatine selected an actual naval officer with experience to lead starfighter doctrine and procurement of said platforms. But Palpatine's top-down approach created a platform that, like him, was potent, but also extreme in design, exposing great strengths, but also exposing great weaknesses for his enemies to exploit. Rafe Sienar was a brilliant Starship designer, but he was really focused on innovation and technologies. Did he actually understand the threats that the Galactic Empire would face in its future? Did Emperor Palpatine? I guess this is what you get when you have a hierarchical power structure like the Empire, where one man's personalities and tendencies are reflected and then increased by many magnitudes through the flawed but also brilliant people they put in charge of various programs. Well, there you have it, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about Sienar Fleet Systems. Was this ultimately a good choice for the Empire for their multi-purpose fighter program? Today I want to tell you guys a very interesting story about a Starship components manufacturer who was basically forced into building a fighter platform. And this was a very uninspired design, but somehow it accidentally became one of the most prolific starfighters of its generation. I guess you could say that this is a tale of the ultimate overachiever. So in the years leading up to the Clone Wars, the defense industry had remained suppressed without much growth or innovation for almost 1,000 years. The Ruusan Reformation more or less got rid of all federal military spending, and therefore you didn't have large Starship manufacturing contracts anymore. The existing manufacturers in the galaxy had to rely on much smaller scale planetary defense force or corporate security contracts. Now, if you're lucky, you might be able to contract an entire sector defense force, or maybe one of your platforms is so popular that multiple PDFs will actually deploy them. But, gone was the era of 10,000 credit toilet seats. Without federal military funding, you couldn't build large-scale industrial military firms. The Starship manufacturers that existed before the Ruusan Reformation had to basically shift over to building civilian and commercial products as well, in order to survive. But then a crazy political catalyst occurred overnight that changed the entire industry of Starship manufacturing, and that was the appearance of the Separatist droid army and the Jedi-led clone army. You suddenly had demand for starfighters the galaxy had not seen in 1,000 years. And I can't understate just how big this demand was. There was a general panic in the Grand Army of the Republic in those early days. People watched in horror as more than 200 Jedi died at Petronaki Arena, and then a bunch more ran headfirst at the droid fortifications on Geonosis, leading a bunch of 9-year-old clones waving around that lightsaber in the air, helping enemy artillery walk in their rounds. It was a complete bloodbath, but what people don't realize is the situation could have been a lot worse. A lot of people forget that during the Battle of Geonosis, the clone army was deployed in a fleet of transports, the Acclamator-class assault ship, without any capital ships escorting them. The Vanderer-class Star Destroyer wouldn't see action until many months later at the Battle of Christophsis, so those Acclamators were basically going in naked. I mean, they did have fighter cover, but that came in the form of a test squadron full of prototype V-19 starfighters and the Jedi's own Delta 7 Aether Light interceptors. The clones were lucky that none of those transports got shot down, because if one did, you would lose, 5 to 10% of your entire invasion army. So it's kind of crazy. Now, while Mace Windu and Yoda were rushing to the battlefields of the Clone Wars, basically Republic military procurement officers were scouring the galaxy for Starship manufacturers. It was a desperate time. While multi-purpose fighters and interceptors like the V-19 and Delta 7 Aether Sprite existed because of the security needs of planetary defense forces, there were, however, a severe lack of other types of ships that just weren't very common in the galaxy, like gunships, for instance. The Kaminoans luckily had secretly contracted Kuat Systems Engineering, who secretly contracted their own subsidiary Rathana Heavy Engineering into making the LAAT multi-purpose platform. But after Geonosis, it became clear that they needed a more protected, faster, and hyperdrive-equipped fighter. Ideally, a ground assault/fighter bomber. Problem was, that wasn't something that you'd normally find in a planetary defense force, and the Republic Judicial Forces kind of frowned upon carpet bombing. There also wasn't that much capital ship versus capital ship duels in the galaxy at the time, so you essentially had a complete vacuum in this one type of ship. I mean, 90% of space combat at the time was between patrol vessels and, modified freighters used by pirates. Most of them were probably created by Corellian Incom Corporation. I mean, they kind of sold to both sides, made a killing. Now, some industrial manufacturers saw the writing on the wall and detected the growing unrest, especially in the Outer Rim territories, in the centuries or so leading up to the Clone Wars. Two of these companies would basically start manufacturing starships, taking advantage of the economic demand, and one of those companies was Incom Corporation. In the decades leading up to the Clone Wars, they had produced a pretty well-received Z-95 Headhunter, and that would basically get them through the door and land them a pretty lucrative multi-purpose starfighter contract, and eventually they would also land the ARC-170 contract as well. The other company that entered the Starship manufacturing industry was Koensayr Manufacturing. They were based on the planet of Koensayr, a small grand colony. Now, most Starship consumers would have never heard of a company like this, but if you were a shipbuilder, there's actually a good chance that Koensayr Manufacturing was one of your vendors. At one point in galactic history, 1 out of every 5 ships basically had a part or component from Koensayr. They were known for building excellent engines, but they also tapped into the weapons, shields, and sensor markets. About 72% of their profit basically came from ship components. They also made the famous K-22995 flight helmet, which was favored by Rebel Alliance pilots during the Galactic Civil War. As a company, Koensayr enjoyed staying on the parts and components manufacturing side of the business. Design and sales is a completely different world from understanding how to build factories and engineer cost-efficient and reliable parts. But the Republic was desperate to put more firepower into their starfighter platforms. The V-19 and Delta-class Aether Sprite lacked the payload to really do damage against larger separatist warships, and the Republic Navy, especially in those early years, was completely outgunned and outnumbered. And so, putting proton torpedoes and proton bombs on a small fighter platform was kind of a no-brainer. It was cost-efficient and could be manufactured much quicker than a bunch of capital ships. Also, the Republic Clone Army planetside was getting overwhelmed by the massive, cheaply manufactured droid army. But the only thing that was holding the onslaught back was clever use of combined arms tactics. And now they needed another arm, a flying arm. Ideally a tactical bomber, because those droid armies were getting way too close to clone positions, and that just wasn't something that the Republic could afford to do. You can't have a lot of losses when it takes 9 years to train your soldiers. And so the Republic Navy, without any alternatives, without any Starship manufacturers creating a ship that filled their needs, went directly to Koensayr Manufacturing and commissioned a fighter bomber from them. So this was most likely because Koensayr Manufacturing already had a lot of ship parts lying around, a lot of engines that were ready to be utilized. The BTLB Y-Wing was the result of this contract. Built around 2 Koensayr R-200 ion jets, this 23.4 meter long fighter bomber was massive, especially when compared to the diminutive Separatist droid fighter. I mean, take a look at how big the freaking engine is on this thing compared to a trooper. The Y-Wing was just way too large for its purpose in a lot of ways, especially if you consider the design preferences of the time, but clearly Koensayr Manufacturing didn't have the experience or time to build a more efficient model, and so this is basically what the Republic got. Luckily, the Venator-class Star Destroyer could accommodate such a large ship that was basically the size of a gunboat. The Y-Wing was so long that a rear turret position was incorporated into the fighter to protect it from any interceptors that might be trailing it. But here's the thing, the large engines, the large space frame meant that you could hold up to 12 proton torpedoes and 2 launchers, or the equivalent in bombs, and that was a significant amount of firepower. That was more than enough to scrap an entire Separatist fleet or turn an entire droid army on the ground into spare parts. Now, Koensayr Manufacturing sacrificed speed and maneuverability not just for firepower, but also for durability. I mean, this ship had a lot of armored plating on it and also had a very strong deflector shield that was powered by a very strong power plant because, again, those engines were so powerful. So everything was kind of upscaled a little bit because this was a very rushed and cobbled together design. I would argue that this was a fluke, a complete fluke, because on paper this thing should not have performed nearly as well as it did. But here's the thing, I mean, the Y-Wing's large, bulky size actually gave it a huge advantage in a strange way, because Clone Wars era dogfighters were smaller and lighter vessels. It was basically all about maneuverability. I mean, take a look at Republic fighters, they're pretty small, but droid fighters were even smaller. I mean, these things didn't have cockpits, life support systems, they were extremely short range. And so while the Y-Wing flew like a flying dump truck, it had more than enough armor to basically absorb any type of punishment that the nimble but lightly armed droid fighters in the Separate fleet could dish out. If Incom had the capacity to manufacture this bomber, they probably would have won the contract, and they would have developed an overcomplicated, expensive platform that would have taken ages to deploy. And if Kuat Systems Engineering got this platform, they would have designed like a wedge-shaped fighter, probably, and you wouldn't have as much payload stored on board. And Koensayr actually had time and experience to develop a more competitive platform. They probably would have built a sleeker, lighter ship that was less powerful, had less durability and less payload, and it probably would have suffered more losses, and it would not have been nearly as effective as the Y-Wing. Because again, the Republic was fighting a quality versus quantity battle, and so firepower was really the key word. The Y-Wing, despite looking like the supermarket brand of fighters, became extremely beloved by the pilots and also the troops on the ground who witnessed their awe-inspiring bombing runs. I mean, this was one of the smallest ships in the entire Republic fleet that could carry the electro-proton bomb, and that thing could wipe out an entire droid field army and leave organics in the area unharmed. Ultimately, this clunky vessel became one of the most underrated platforms in the entire Clone Wars. One could argue that without it, the Republic would have never defeated the Separatist Alliance. You could also say the same thing about the Rebellion's victory against the Empire. And here's the thing, a lot of the qualities of the Y-Wing that were considered poor design choices during the Clone Wars actually made it very relevant 2 decades later during the Galactic Civil War. Actually, the new Rebellion faced a very similar situation to the Republic when they were looking for a fighter bomber. At the time, the Rebel Starfighter Corps was primarily made up of small blockade runners and snub fighters, all hyperdrive equipped. They were carrying out hit-and-run attacks against the Empire and needed something that could punch a lot heavier, but still could run away before the Empire countered. The Y-Wing had actually been retired at the end of the Clone Wars. The Empire was going in a different direction, and so a lot of these ships were either donated or just sold to local planetary defense forces, and thousands more were lying in scrapyards waiting for decommissioning. And of course, a great deal were bought by funds given to the rebellion by Bail Organa and Mon Money Mothma, and even more were stolen. Now, the Rebel engineers and mechanics had to modify these BTLB Y-Wings to such an extent that it basically became its own broke-ass variant called the BTLA-4 Y-Wing. But these adjustments didn't fundamentally change what the Y-Wing was. Instead, they were done to, essentially make it more suitable for the Rebel Alliance's very special needs. For instance, the Rebellion didn't have enough pilots, let alone gunners, to sit in that rear turret, so that was gone. And while they were back there, they chopped off several meters from the back of the ship by removing the engine nacelles, making the ship 25% shorter and a much smaller target for TIE fighters. They also removed a lot of armored panels from the back of the ship where the engine and power plant was. This wasn't just to reduce weight, it was to give engineers and mechanics more access to these engines. Remember, the R200s were basically the same ion jet engines that were used during the Clone Wars, and 20 years later they were starting to show their age, and so they needed constant love and maintenance. I mean, honestly, the Rebel mechanics were the true heroes of the war. And, George Lucas would have been proud of them because he was kind of a hot rodder. So he would have enjoyed the fact that they made a new type of Y-Wing by just modifying it. This thing is basically a hot rod. But yeah, what you ultimately got was a lighter and faster starfighter. It's probably closer to what Koensayr Manufacturing would have built had they had a little more time in the design room. But ultimately, that titanium frame and reinforced alloy steel alloy of the original Clone Wars era vessel hadn't aged a second. And while it was overkill during the Clone Wars, where you had a lot of lighter, maybe ships using composite materials, for the Galactic Civil War and its hectic dogfights, the Y-Wing was a lot more survivable and therefore kind of perfect. In many ways, it had surprisingly reached its prime 20 years after it was first launched. The massive payload on board this thing again made it the ideal bomber for the rebellion. It was far more successful at taking down capital ships than the B-Wing and that fugly Star Fortress thing. That mining rig got more people killed on board than it actually did killing. It's kind of funny if you think about it. No manufacturer ever put so little effort to build a platform that became so successful and long-lived. I feel like if you're a Starship designer or a manufacturer, you're probably shaking your fist at the screen right now, but that's just how the industry works sometimes. Sometimes people get lucky, sometimes random things can happen. I mean, it's almost controversial for me to even say that the Y-Wing was an overachiever or poorly designed, because it's definitely one of the most beloved starships in the galaxy. But if you had read the trade journals at the time, they would have ripped it apart. Which goes to show you, you can only tell so much by reading the spec sheets. I mean, a lot of times you have to let a starship just enter the field and see what it can do. Sometimes they'll surprise you. Kind of like the A-10 Warthog, which was supposed to be retired many years ago, but surprisingly found a nice niche and just adapted to the role it needed to enter. Yeah, the Y-Wing and the A-10 Warthog are basically, they're like spiritual cousins, you know what I mean? But anyway, this is why when I heard Consolidated Koensayr Manufacturing and Holdings started producing the BTA-NR2 Y-Wing, which essentially is just an updated version of the Rebels' jury-rigged Frankenstein bomber, I went all in and bought a bunch of stock in the company because, nostalgia sells, and, that platform, it just works. It's got decades of testing in the field. Today we're going to be spotlighting a starfighter manufacturer that holds a very special place in the industry. They've crafted some of the most legendary fighters ever, blending sleek aesthetics with unparalleled functionality. I'm talking about none other than Incom Corporation, the brilliant minds behind the T-65V X-Wing, the starfighter that won the Galactic Civil War. Now, Incom Corporation is quite a unique company. If you take a look at their wide range of products, there's a very clear design philosophy driven by a very focused and progressively minded company culture that has managed to keep Incom ahead of their competitors in all the most meaningful ways. Today we're going to take a look at how this humble corporation came out of nowhere and became one of the most inspirational and beloved starship manufacturers in the Star Wars galaxy. Now, we've talked about a lot of larger and older legacy starship manufacturers in our previous videos, like Hoersch and Kessel Corporation, which has been building ships for thousands of years. So older companies face a very similar problem that, if you're a gamer, you face when you're at the end game of a game like SimCity or maybe Civilization. The original infrastructure, the departments that you build to design, manufacture, and market your products are eventually going to become antiquated. It's extremely hard to properly plan and structure your company to be operational, within 100 years, let alone thousands of years. And so a lot of these older companies have older mindsets, they use older manufacturing techniques, and they're just a lot more rigid in their culture and how they do things. Some of these more vertically integrated corporations that manufacture all of their own parts and components might even be held back by how their factories are set up. For instance, Sienar Fleet Systems was heavily invested in the twin-ion engine, which was designed for the TIE Fighter line. It's truly an engineering marvel, and probably one of the best propulsion systems to ever come out of Sienar Fleet Systems. But the problem is when you have a very well-designed platform, you tend to lean on it very heavily, and you probably don't focus on investing for alternatives, which can hurt you down the road. So let's say 20-30 years down the road, we find out that fuel thrusters, like the ones found on the T-65V, while less efficient, are far more powerful than the twin-ion engine setup. Sienar Fleet Systems might continue to try to invest in a more antiquated technology like the twin-ion setup, and that's because they might not have enough resources or the internal political will to switch over to fuel thrusters. Remember, you'd have to design a new factory, hire new people, and more importantly, you have to hire old staff who might be very loyal to your company. And of course, if you do that, it's going to hurt morale. Such is the cruel reality of very competitive markets like the starship manufacturing industry. So even though it's pretty hard for a small corporation to break into what is really just a highly competitive market with a lot of government corruption and favoritism, more focused and newer startups do have a slight advantage over more traditional companies when you have the introduction of new technology or just like a new political culture. Basically, the playing field is leveled out. Think about EV manufacturing. China was absolutely terrible back in the day at creating internal combustion engine cars. They basically copy a lot of designs as well, which wasn't great. And the truth was they were far too behind in their technology and developing the supply chains and infrastructure necessary to have some kind of homegrown car industry. They did have a few companies here and there, but nothing that really was successful enough for export. But with the beginning of the EV revolution, you saw hundreds of Chinese companies spring out of nowhere. These were startups that had to create their own new supply chains and technologies. Many would fail, but because of a huge domestic market and demand, and also very large government subsidies, the Chinese EV companies that survived were far better situated to make EV cars than traditional internal combustion engine manufacturers, who still have suppliers who make products you won't even find on an EV, like a combustion engine or a transmission. Traditional car manufacturers face a dilemma. Do you get rid of old departments that are no longer relevant or won't be relevant in 10 years? Do you get rid of old suppliers and fully invest in the future, or do you split your resources between the old and the new? Either way, they're at a disadvantage because they don't have a clear focus on which direction they want to go. Companies like Volvo actually spun off their EV company Polestar so that it could focus solely on EV development with its own board and executive staff. I think that's probably the better way of doing this. I'm not even sure if EV adoption in its current form is a good idea, as inevitable as it might be. What this is really about is understanding how disruptive new technologies can be, how they can create openings for new startup companies to get in and gain market share. And so that's kind of what Incom Corporation did with the Starship manufacturing industry. They actually didn't start out doing Starships. They were, however, in the Starship manufacturing supply chain. They manufactured repulsor lifts. Repulsor lifts are an incredibly important anti-gravity technology that basically replaced the wheel in the Star Wars galaxy. Okay, like most wheels. And this is a device that can lift anything from Han Solo's frozen body to an entire city, like Cloud City on Bespin. This is actually one of Incom Corporation's greatest engineering projects, a true galactic wonder when you think about it, and quite an opportunistic project. You notice that Incom always seems to be in the right place at the right time until it's not. You see, city-sized repulsor lifts are extremely expensive to build, but they're also extremely expensive to fuel. But since Cloud City was the administrative colony for a huge Tabana gas mining operation, it actually had access to unlimited amounts of cheap fuel. That's kind of what made this entire project possible, and it was a great look for Incom's portfolio. Cloud City was built in 400 BBY during the High Republic era, and the galaxy at the time was completely demilitarized. So creating repulsor lifts was a far more lucrative business plan than creating starfighters at the time. But Incom, like a lot of corporations, started sensing the unrest in the following centuries, especially in the Outer Rim, and they understood that there would be a need for starfighters, especially for planetary defense forces. In summer 147 BBY, Incom Corporation teamed up with Subpro, a starship manufacturer based in the Inner Rim. They weren't as glamorous as a lot of the more core-based starship manufacturers, and a lot of their ships were seen as inferior, which is why most of their products were actually sold to the Outer Rim. But I would actually argue that Outer Rim customers are a bit more discerning when it comes to making a starship purchase. They're a lot more rational, I think, than core-world customers who are looking for flashy exteriors, interiors, very powerful engines, stuff like that. People in the Outer Rim generally have less credits to spend to begin with, and also they need a much more reliable product because of the complete lack of infrastructure out there. Like when your starship breaks down in the Outer Rim, you are in a lot of trouble. And because of that, these starships also need to be pretty simple to work on as well. So in this joint venture, Incom Corporation would learn a lot from Subpro's starship manufacturing experience, how to take a design and bring it all the way to a finished product and then market it and deliver it. And Incom Corporation would bring the majority of the capital investment for this joint venture. Together, the two companies would build the Z-95 Headhunter and also the Aggressive Reconnaissance 170 Starfighter, both superb starfighters in their own right. We've done a lot of in-depth videos talking about both of these platforms. We've, really done deep dives into the stats and specs and, like what they can do. In this video, we're going to talk more about the design philosophy and business strategy of rolling out these starfighters. The Z-95 was probably the most bare-bones starfighter ever created by Incom. It's very much a pre-Clone Wars era fighter. multi-purpose and targeted towards planetary defense forces, which usually couldn't field too many different platforms and too many units. And so these starfighters lacked the hyperdrive to save on costs. Most planetary defense forces only needed to stay in local regions anyway, but they did have shielding and a variety of different armaments, including blaster cannons, concussion missile launchers, and a very useful ion cannon for disabling ships. The Z-95 was very well received and performed extremely well in the Outer Rim. They were reliable and sturdy and economic all at the same time. They're basically the perfect tool for the job. As a platform, the Z-95 would remain very popular and in use all the way until like the Rebel Alliance days. Now, one of the smart things that Incom did with its starfighters is, from an aesthetic point of view, they made them look like more beefed up versions of air speeders. And so you have the large wingspan, while pretty unnecessary in space. It provoked a sense of beauty and elegance. It reminded customers that yes, this thing can fly. And since, most of Incom's customers did come from the Outer Rim, and a lot of these guys grew up flying air speeders, I think that really, the design motifs on this resonates with a lot of people. It also doesn't hurt that unlike a TIE fighter, when an Incom product loses power, it at least has a chance to glide down safely to Earth. Vertical wings do not generate lift, guys. Now, Incom, as a repulsor lift company, also had a very successful line of speeders for quite some time. You had, for instance, the T-13 airspeeder and also the widely popular T-16 Skyhopper. At just 7,500 credits, the T-16 was a relatively cheap vehicle that most colonists and farmers could afford. These were extremely light aircraft that had excellent performance. Many famous rebel fighters started out as bush pilots, flying the T-16 around. This includes Luke Skywalker. Now, Incom was kind of smart. They basically made sure that the controls of every one of their ships were pretty similar to one another. All the buttons were in the same places. So if you could fly one of their ships, like the T-16, you could also fly their more complicated platforms like the Z-95 or even the X-Wing and ARC-170. This is a really smart business choice, I think, from Incom. Basically, Incom is positioning themselves at very different parts of the market, and they're like, hey, your first speeder is going to be us, and your last starfighter is also most likely going to be a purchase to us. Come into our integrated system. And the T-13 and T-16 weren't the only speeders they made. They also had the T-24 and the more robust T-35, which was basically just one step away from an actual starfighter. So from a design standpoint, you have controls that are pretty, universal through all of the platforms. Sort of like how Apple or Nvidia created its own software and interface to force people to use their products. But Incom takes it a step further. They don't want you to just be comfortable with flying their platforms. They want you to love what they make.
That's one hell of a pilot!
Not just from an aesthetic point of view, but also from a function point of view. When the Clone Wars began, the Z-95 was already starting to show its age, and it was modified and upgraded for the Clone Army's needs, and it would compete with other interceptors like the much newer V-19 and the even newer V-Wing. Incom decided instead of focusing on what was a crowded market for short-range interceptors, they would focus on much more niche products like the Aggress Reconnaissance 170 starfighter. The Republic Navy's Venator-class Star Destroyers were assault carriers, and each one needed a wing of long-range patrol and scouting vessels that could also double as an attack craft. The ARC-170 fit those needs, but was basically the exact opposite of the bare-bones designs of the Z-95. This thing had 3 crew slots, a rear gunner turret, a 1.5 hyperdrive, along with a very unique and robust medium laser cannon setup. Very few starfighters of its size had lasers as potent. We did an entire video about how the ARC-170 was misused as a platform and was actually a really great starfighter, but ultimately misused by the Republic Navy at the Battle of Coruscant, which is what doomed the company from getting future contracts. I would argue that it's hard to foresee political events like the collapse of the Galactic Republic, which is why, as an investor, it's important to diversify your portfolio and not invest money that you can't afford to lose. Incom Corporation, despite being an excellent company, zeroed out. And sometimes that just happens, even if there's no warning signs that it will happen. I'll admit I'm not really an activist investor, but there are certain things from a moral position that I just won't invest in, like the death stick industry, or large gaming corpos like Kanto Bytes. There are also companies that I do like ideologically, and I will, buy a few shares here and there just to show them some support. Because in the Star Wars galaxy, in the Republic, the greatest religion and belief system is the capital markets, and there are very few incentives for corpos to do the right thing. The structure of a corporation oftentimes is designed to alleviate individual responsibility from the actions one make on behalf of that corporation. And what Incom does during the rise of the Empire is both idiotic but also courageous and somewhat inspirational. Incom would be one of the many corporations targeted by the Empire's nationalization efforts, and most of Incom's core design and engineering team would defect to the rebellion. One of their greatest priorities was to bring their latest prototype, the T-65B X-Wing, to the rebellion directly. Although Saw Gerrera and his crazies did attack an Incom factory and looted a bunch of X-Wings for themselves. The 8 X-Wings they had would form a squadron known as the Cavern Angels. The X-Wing was basically the sum of all of Incom's previous designs and experiences, as perfectly balanced of a ship as humanly possible. It had the simple, streamlined design of the Headhunter, with almost 80% of the functionality and extra goodies you found on the ARC 170. It had grid maneuverability, durability, shields, along with a diverse and powerful armament, including proton torpedo launchers and 4 individual wingtip lasers. If the Rebellion needed just one ship to do everything, then this was it. This was an interceptor, an escort, superiority fighter, and even a decent assault bomber in a pinch. Remember, both Death Stars and a Starkiller base was taken out by an X-Wing. More importantly, the familiarity of Incom control surfaces made this fighter extremely accessible to the collection of moisture farmers and smugglers who were being trained to fly against the mighty Empire. A lot of these amateur pilots did have, experience on Incom's airspeeder line, and so that made it a lot easier for them to transition to these state-of-the-art starfighters. The X-Wing was extremely easy and intuitive to fly, and it was nowhere near as finicky as something like the A-Wing. The last ship that Incom Corporation built before it was nationalized was one of the largest, the UT-60D U-Wing. Like all later Incom crafts, it had those Fusel engines along with the variable geometry wings, and a very sleek presentation overall. This was a support/transport ship that was actually relatively nimble for its size. It was terrific for carrying special forces units on quick insertion extraction operations, although its carrying capacity was quite low for its class. The U-Wing also had fast enough cruising speed so that it wouldn't necessarily hold back its escort fighters, and it became quite popular amongst the rebellion. Bail Organa would actually accidentally organize the transfer of U-Wings into rebel hands, and they would be used by various factions of insurgents, including Saw Gerrera's partisans and also the larger factions like the Masasi group. There was also a civilian variant of the U-Wing known as the BT-45D. It had half the engines. Incom under Imperial rule struggled quite a lot to pump out, excellent designs, and I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that most of the team left. One of the products Incom Corporation made under Imperial rule was the short-range interceptor known as the I-7 Howl Runner. It was actually a pretty decent little ship. It had very accessible controls comparable to the rest of the Incom line, and it was actually faster than the T-65B X-Wing, and it had shields, which is a big upgrade from the TIE Fighter. It also had a pretty small profile, making it difficult to hit. However, its cannons were quite weak. When deployed, the Empire usually sent hordes of these fighters trying to overwhelm enemy ships with the sheer amount of blaster fire coming out of them. The Howl Runner, however, lacked heavy munitions. It only had 2 laser cannons, and, had Incom actually put some proper effort into upgrading this platform, I think it would have been a pretty decent ship. In the last year of the Galactic Civil War, right after the Battle of Endor, all of the defectors from Incom would come together and form a new corporation known as Incom Freitech. They started out by producing the T-65B X-Wing in a more standardized fashion, and quickly rolled out the T-70 as well, which is an improvement on the original X-Wing in almost every way. It was especially heavily armored and shielded, showing Incom's dedication for keeping its pilots and customers safe. There was also some minor changes. Instead of having to use a crane to top-load a droid into the astromech slot, the droids could now be loaded from below the X-Wing from a lift. Droids were also given an interface to more easily fly the ship from the astromech slot. And decades later, Admiral Akbar, before he was unceremoniously sucked into space, petitioned for an upgrade for the T-70 project, and that became the T-85 X-Wing. This variant was as fast as the original A-Wing and had extremely advanced sensor suite on board, but decades of pacifism and cuts to the military budget meant that the New Republic pilots behind the control sticks of a T-85 X-Wing lacked the skill to fully take advantage of these crafts. Some of the best pilots in the galaxy were probably Rebel Alliance veterans who were now fighting in the Resistance, and of course, they all preferred the T-70. We had one last fighter during the New Republic age that Incom designed, and it was this beauty, the Tri-Wing S-91X Pegasus Starfighter, which they made with help from the Porsche design team. We don't really get to see this starfighter in action, but it definitely is a look. Well, there you have it, guys. That is the very interesting story of Incom Corporation. As you see, it's not always about having the largest market share or having the largest backers. Sometimes if you think a little differently, you can create some truly unique products. Of course, at the same time, Incom ultimately was destroyed as a company. If you had invested in them, you would have zeroed out, which is never a good thing, and that just shows us how volatile the Starship manufacturing industry can be. I've always believed that it's the struggles a species goes through that defines its true nature. I look at humanity, for instance, and our generations of struggle for dominance on this crazy disc world we live on, and I'm brought to tears by our greatness, from early man's clashes and defeat of the dinosaurs. To the Northern Song Dynasty's heroic defense of the Great Wall against those alien lizard monsters. Then there's America's lesser-known struggles against the vampire legions of the Confederacy. And of course, the landed gentry's heroic stand against the zombie hordes that were rampant across the English countryside in the early 18th century.
Her face is rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes.
Growing up, I always loved social studies for this reason, because it taught us about the sacrifice and hardships that the generations before us made to make sure that we can continue to thrive as a species, so that we can grow and learn and rise up to the generational challenges that we face today, like the great threat beneath the waves, the dolphin menace, who benefits more from rising sea levels than any other species on this planet. Humanity is strong because we refuse to die. We're shaped by our past traumas and the difficulties and hardships we faced and endured in order to survive. And if you take a look at the Star Wars galaxy, a similar Darwinism exists that propels certain species to glory and recognition. Take the Kaminoans, for instance. They became master cloners because of a series of natural disasters that flooded their homeworld. Or the Hutts, who evolved on an extremely violent planet full of apex predators and through cunning and sheer grit, managed to survive and spread across the galaxy as criminal syndicates. The company I want to talk to you guys about today, known as Slayn Korpil, was also formed by a very hardy species known as the verpine. They're an insectoid hive mind species, and their origin story and struggle is quite unique, and perhaps horrific, if we ever find out what exactly happened to them. Not even the verpine are sure about their history, but some type of cataclysm destroyed their original home world, which is why in the more modern era of Star Wars, we find all 1.6 billion of them located in an area called the Hoersch asteroid field. It's theorized by many that this field is all that's left of their planet. Now, asteroid fields are generally terrible places to call home because they are lifeless celestial bodies too small to hold any atmosphere of any kind. As such, a great deal of ingenuity and discipline and efficiency is needed to survive in such environments. Each one of the asteroids that the verpine colonize need to have their own self-sustainable artificial atmospheres. The verpine were run by a technocratic government, and their species were organized to be industrious and very productive. The verpine were known for creating all sorts of unique high-end technology that was highly sought after by the entire galaxy. As a matter of fact, once the verpine realized that they could export all of their technology, they completely changed the makeup of their hives. Prior to this, the majority of the population was made up of worker drones, and only a few percentage of the verpine species were considered intelligent. Once these export markets were opened, though, the queens of the colonies started creating more intelligent verpine workers. This newfound individualism in the verpine colonies led to a creation of all types of new products, including verpine shatter small arms, which were highly sought after by assassins, bounty hunters, special forces units all across the galaxy. These were handheld railguns that had the ability to fire tiny slugs at ridiculous speeds. Its armor and shield penetration was second to none. And as an added bonus, such weapons were almost impossible to block with a lightsaber. It's also thanks to verpine shipwrights' advancements in deflector shield technology that the entire capital ship industry would change as well. Prior to this, the invention of turbolasers made the creation of large capital ships a huge liability, thus ending the dreadnought era of the Old Republic. It's thanks to these verpine deflector shields that once again capital ships started gaining in size. And it wasn't just the verpine shipwrights' deflector shield technology that was advanced. A lot of their ship designs were also leading in their class. This might be due to the inherent danger and difficult to navigate environments the Hoersch asteroid field presented to Verpine spacers. And so Verpine ships were known to be both robust and also very maneuverable. One of the most famous Verpine shipwrights would be Slayn Korpil. They served as not only the Galactic Republic and the Rebel Alliance, but also the Jedi Order. Perhaps it was the Verpine's precarious existence that made them appreciate factions that not only looked out for the majority, but also gave voice and protection to smaller groups like theirs. The first ship we'll be taking a look at from Slayn Korpil features two very classic design motifs that we'll see in a lot of their ships. This is the T-6 Jedi Shuttle. It was an unarmed transport used by the Jedi Order in the decades leading up to the Clone Wars. These ships were aesthetically quite beautiful, fitting in well with the design of the era. It features a wing that rotates around the main fuselage and engine of the vessel. The Verpine were famous for creating variable geometry ships and incorporating gyros and gimbals on the body of their craft. Most Verpine ships are vertically oriented when they're in flight mode. This could be due to a natural aesthetic taste. I also believe that the vertical orientation and rotating wings was also due to the need for Verpine pilots to navigate through tight spaces in the Hoersch asteroid field. Once the T-6 was preparing for land, the vertical wing would rotate back to a horizontal position, making landing much easier. The interior is very ergonomically designed, and as someone who spends most of his time in cities inside of cramped apartments, I really like how the central couch area can be concealed in the floor.
Look at all this floor space. So much aerobics in here. So many activities.
This is clearly a design choice made by a species that's used to living in very confined spaces inside of an asteroid. Slayn Korpil also designed the much more traditional looking H-2 executive shuttle, which was used by Supreme Chancellor Palpatine to escape from the Zillo Beast. Unfortunately, it wasn't fast enough to escape its grasp. SNK also has one speeder in their lineup, the Praxis Mark I turbo speeder, also built for the Jedi. Aesthetically, it shares some of the same lines as the T-6 shuttle. This was a preferred company vehicle that Anakin liked using while flying around Coruscant. And if Anakin likes it, well, that's a good thing, because it was just rumored that he liked to partake in illegal speeder races in the Coruscant Underground. As a matter of fact, that's what he and Padme used to do on date nights when they're trying to escape the Republic press and the Jedi's prying eyes. The Praxis Mark I's top speed is a mild 160 kilometers per hour. I imagine it's probably limited on Coruscant because you don't want people going faster than that in the space lanes. This thing basically at the same top speed has the insane turbo tank. The speeder was also outfitted with a standard navigation system with special Jedi programming to bypass heavy sky traffic. That's basically how Coruscant sky traffic worked. You had to stay in the predefined space lanes unless you were an emergency vehicle. Then you could, I guess, fly in any direction. The ship also had a collision detection system. It's kind of like those new driver assists on cars that keeps your, vehicle centered in the lane and will jerk your wheel when you least expect it. Absolutely terrifying, I hate it. One unique feature with this speeder is the twin repulsor generators on board, which gives this ship the ability to run upside down. Because, Jedi. Now, enough with the civilian stuff. Let's move on to SNK's more potent, militarized ships. First, we have the V-19 Torrent Starfighter. This was actually still in its prototype phase when the Republic essentially requested every working model of this fighter when the first Battle of Geonosis happened out of nowhere. And so, aside from a handful of Delta 7 Ether-class light interceptors piloted by the Jedi, the Republic had nothing else for fighter support for their fleet of 12 Acclimator-class assault ships. And so, it was a V-19 test squadron that was cobbled together at the last moment that would exceed all expectations and help the clone army make it past the orbital defenses on Geonosis and to the planet's surface. That or Count Dooku purposely made sure that none of those acclimators were shot down, because you needed a war to happen for Palpatine to take over. Regardless of what happened, this was a huge win for Slayn Korpil. They would land a massive contract with the Galactic Republic Navy. The V-19 would become one of the main general-purpose starfighters used by the Republic. Each Venator-class Star Destroyer had room for multiple wings of these fighters. The V-19 again featured that unique Verpine approach to design, which involves a variable geometry wing. When in a landed position, the foils fold up and above the craft. A design choice that was actually inspired by the World War II era F-4U Koensayr, which also had folding wings, which helped it save space on board packed aircraft carriers. There's also a third stabilizer on the ship that flips down to below the fuselage once in flight, and there's actually a third engine on it, giving the starfighter that classic Verpine vertical look. And at just 6 meters in length, these were quite comparable in size to the Separatist droid fighters, and they really did a decent job in keeping up with them in a dogfight. Equipped with laser cannons and medium concussion missiles, these fighters were mostly delegated to an interceptor role. They were also designed as escort fighters for the BTLB Y-wing fighter bombers. Later models were also equipped with a hyperdrive internally, although earlier models could use hyperspace rings to travel to other systems. It should be noted that the V-19's twin-ion design would later be the basis for Quad Systems Engineering's Alpha 3 Nimbus-class V-wing, which in turn would be the inspiration for the TIE fighter. You can say that the V-19 was the first to really prove to the galaxy that the twin-ion engine setup is ideal for short-range interceptors. Despite SNK's excellent V-19 platform, the Republic under Chancellor Palpatine would drift away from the corporation. My theory is they were a relatively small company, also a company of aliens, and they just didn't have the same political clout and presence in the Senate as larger corporations did, especially compared to Quad Systems Engineering, whose parent company, Kuat Drive Yards, along with their subsidiary Rothana Heavy Engineering, produced a huge percentage of all capital ships, fighters, and vehicles, and other war material the Republic used during the Clone Wars. Palpatine, after all, was all about consolidation of the military-industrial complex. The Verpine were actually quite a pacifist species. It was kind of rare for them to build ships with weapons on them. This was just a need they had to fill in during the Republic's Clone Wars. This might be one of the major reasons why Palpatine actually skipped over the company when nationalizing much of the military-industrial complex in the galaxy. Verpine would, however, be approached by Bail Organa and 4BBY with an interesting proposal. The Mon Calamari master engineer known as Corey had been developing a unique blockade-busting starfighter. The Rebel Alliance was in great need of such a vehicle because the Empire had started carrying out a series of blockades on planets that were potentially providing refuge or support to the Rebel movement. The prototype, known as the B-6 Blade Wing, was actually inspired by a series of Clone Wars starships, primarily the H-60 Tempest bomber, a failed SNK design that was ultimately not accepted by the Republic because the clones found it quite difficult to fly. The pilot and gunners on this platform sat on opposite ends of the vessel in individual cockpits. Corey was a huge fan of the folding wings on the V-19. He was also a huge fan of the gimbal gyroscopic setup of the wing, the T-6 shuttle, and he kind of combined that into the H-60 Tempest's body. It's a mishmash of all sorts of different things. The B-6 Blade Wing prototype was extremely fast and agile, and ace pilot Harrison Dula didn't seem to have problems with the awkward configuration of the ship, which allowed the pilot to essentially rotate the entire body of the vessel around the cockpit. The B-6 prototype also featured an extremely powerful composite beam laser, which was able to rip an Archidance-class light cruiser in half. SNK would agree to manufacture this prototype, and they would make some pretty significant changes to the size and armament on the ship, and what you would get is the B-Wing. But the production model's flight characteristics were nowhere near as good as the original prototype. The ship was far less maneuverable and only really fast in a straight line. It was also a less capable dogfighter than the Y-Wing. This most likely is due to the large weapons cluster found on the ship. They removed the composite laser for one reason or another. Maybe it wasn't reliable enough, but yeah, this ship had a lot of firepower, but it was also extremely heavy. At the same time, the rotating body around the chassis proved to be a maintenance issue. These starfighters were in the hangars for repair as often as they were out in the field. The B-Wing would ultimately serve a very important niche in the New Republic's defeat of the Empire, but it would never really replace the Y-Wing. During the Cold War between the First Order and the Resistance would actually modify a few B-Wing Mark II cockpits and other systems to create the Resistance transport. The cockpit could also detach and turn into a transport pod fitted with the hyperdrive. That's how Finn and Rose got to Canto Bight. The last platform that SNK designed that we know of is the MG-100 Star Fortress SF-17 Heavy Bomber. This was a pretty unique, vertically oriented bomber that could carry a payload of up to 1,047 proton bombs. The ship was quite slow and cumbersome. It also lacked adequate shielding and armor. Even with fighter cover and multiple laser turrets on board for anti-starship design, these were very easy to destroy. We theorize that the New Republic commissioned this starship in desperation because they were facing several large Imperial Star Destroyer classes that they didn't really have an answer to, especially the super class dreadnoughts like the Executive. Either way, the Star Fortress wouldn't see combat until the evacuation of Dakar during the Cold War. All 8 of the heavy bombers that were deployed during that mission were destroyed, but one did manage to release its payload on target, and it destroyed an 8-kilometer-long siege dreadnought. So you could say that this platform did its job as intended, although with severe losses. So that is the story of Slayn Korpil. I really like the Starship company because they had a pretty unique approach to Starship design and philosophy, and it shows us that there's more than one way to, cook an egg, to design a short-range interceptor or a bomber, and I think that kind of diversity in Starship design is what really makes the Star Wars galaxy such an interesting place to check out. Very few things terrify me more in the galaxy than a race of sentient insectoid aliens. This is why I'm an apologist for Ender Wiggin. I've also served 3 tours as a hell diver on the Terminids front, and when I got back, I ran an entire Senate campaign based on my proposal to install sensors in our local community to sense potential Tyranid infiltrators amongst our midst. The only immigrant threat we actually need to be worried about in our country. That's the most goddamn American thing I've ever seen. Now, just because you're terrified of something doesn't mean you can't develop a healthy respect for it, like Cara Dune's biceps. What kind of psycho do you have to be to punch Beskar with your bare knuckles? But yeah, when you fear something, it might be counterintuitive to want to learn more about it, but usually that's the best way to control your fear, through understanding it. Because once you understand what it is that you fear, you might dissipate that fear completely, or develop protocols to allow yourself to properly deal with the danger at hand. And so today, in our never-ending quest to understand and discover all the major weapons manufacturers in the galaxy, we'll be taking a look at a company that creates some of the most terrifying products I've ever seen. In a previous video, we mentioned how their products are either designed to create nightmares or commit war crimes. So there's a world in the Inner Rim known as Cola 4, just off of the Perlemian Way. Avoid it. Don't even think about entering that system if you want to come out alive. And that's because they're home to one of the most dangerous and aggressive alien species in the galaxy known as the Colicoids. They're also the individuals behind Colicoid Creation's Nest, the weapons manufacturer we're going to be talking about today. To highlight just how dangerous this species is, we have to go back to Old Republic history during basically their first contact scenario. Multiple representatives were sent to the planet to Cola 4 to try to connect with the local inhabitants, but they kept on getting killed and presumably were eaten. At which point the Old Republic just kind of gave up. Which is interesting because usually the Old Republic tends to escalate when their diplomats get killed and eaten. Military action in these scenarios is the standard procedure. So why didn't the Republic retaliate against the Colicoids? Well, they probably just determined that this species was too violent and not worth fighting, and they skipped over them. Nothing quells the government's endless desire to expand and conquer than a species that is just so undesirable to fight. These Colicoids were absolutely terrifying to look at. They can grow up to 2 meters in height, and their whole entire body was covered in a chitinous armor, which is very hard to pierce with standard energy blasters. They had an extremely violent warrior culture, and the various hives on the planet were constantly at war with one another. To make matters even worse, not only was the species incredibly cruel, barbaric, and animalistic, they were also very, very intelligent. This is a deadly combination. The Colicoids loved to eat. They were carnivorous, and although they weren't exactly picky about what they ate, they really did enjoy eating exotic meats and trying different types of species that they met. They even were occasionally cannibals. And the icing on the cake is this species really just didn't care about the feelings or welfare of other species. Luckily, they were isolationists, so they didn't, turn into a much larger problem through territorial conquests like the Mandalorian Crusaders. But despite this lack of interest in the wider galaxy, the Colicoids did want to get involved with the galactic economy. I mean, almost everyone did. The Colicoids specifically wanted to have access to the diverse galactic meat markets. And not surprisingly, the Colicoids were just as ruthless in their business dealings as they were with warfare. And they could afford to be like this because their society's constant state of violence meant that as a species they were capable of creating some truly unique and deadly weapon systems that were desired by, most of the military forces in the galaxy. During the Old Republic Cold War period, the Republic and the Sith Empire literally competed against each other to buy their products. And by competed, I mean like in a Squid Games-like faction. The Colicoids, for their own entertainment, designed a series of trials held on a remote asteroid where the Republic and the Sith would send their best representatives and try to basically win the favor of these insectoids by competing in gladiatorial contests. Now, during the more peaceful period before the Clone Wars, when weapons became a lot less important, most humans rightfully found this species to be unsettling. Apparently, their language consisted of a bunch of clicking noises and humming from their antennas rubbing together. It probably triggered a disgust in us that is the result of generations of survival-based evolutionary learning. But you know who wasn't bothered by the Colicoids? Well, other near-bug species, like the Nemoidians. The Sith Lord Higo Damask, who was basically in charge of the entire grand plan that ultimately destroyed the Republic and the Jedi, would regularly hold secret meetings at his residence on the moon of Sojourn. He would create network networking events for the various business people and politicians the Sith controlled and helped them essentially create more chaos in the galaxy. It was there that Colicoid Creation's Nest, which we'll call CCN for the rest of the video, made connections to New Gunray from the Trade Federation. New Gunray was quite savage in his own special way. He knew how to speak the Colicoid's language, and he was extremely interested in their droidica line of destroyer droids. And so he sent 50 barge loads of, get this, exotic types of meat from all over the galaxy to win and secure a contract to produce these droidicas. Now, in case you didn't notice, the Colicoids built the droidicas in their own image, sort of like how humans built droids in their own image, and the Geonosians did the same thing as well. It's only natural, I guess. And you can see a lot of the Colicoids' biology in these droidicas. For instance, the way they roll around at very high speeds, well, that's what the Colicoids do. But instead of very thick chitinous armor, the droidicas are given deflector shields, which are all but impossible to destroy with small arms fire. These heavy droids could reach a top speed of 75 kilometers per hour, and once they close in on their target, it's basically game over. They could fire away with 2 twin blaster cannons that were so deadly it often even forced the Jedi to retreat from them. The droidicas would play an extremely important role in the Separatist droid army during the Clone Wars, and the clones and the Jedi actually had to develop special tactics to counter them. CCN would develop several different variants of the droidicas and kind of refine their design over the decades. First, you have the variant they designed for the Trade Federation, the P series, which we see during the invasion of Naboo. Then you have the W series, which we see at the Battle of Petronaki Arena. This variant had larger arms and carried energy-intensive high-yield blasters. This came at the cost of the deflector shields on board, which had to run at a lower level or were just turned off completely. The final variant was rolled out at the end of the Clone Wars, and it was known as the Q series droidica. It improved efficiency of its energy system, which allowed it to be much more balanced in its offensive and defensive capabilities. There was also a droidica sharpshooter variant, which was equipped with a long-range blaster, and it had an armored shell instead of deflector shields. There's also the massive Scorpionek Annihilator droid, which was a towering mecha version of the smaller droids. They essentially just made the droidicas larger, with more firepower and armor. A single one of these things could completely change the course of a battle. It usually took at least a company-sized element of clones to take one down. As you can see, Colicoid Creation Nest had a full range of battle droids, and the Separatist droid army could have just completely outfitted their military force with these very, very competent droids. The only reason why the Trade Federation and later the CIS didn't field an entire army of these products was most likely because of their higher cost. Factoids simply provided much cheaper products that could be easily mass manufactured. Also, a lot of CIS vehicles like the AAT required bipedal ergonomics to operate. I really can't see a droidica piloting anything. Although one could argue that CCN created one of the deadliest starfighters in galactic history, the droid Tri-Fighter. Roughly the same price as the inferior Vulture droid, the Tri-Droid Fighter had an incredibly vicious and aggressive AI droid brain that allowed it to learn quickly from its enemies' tactics. It could even mimic their moves. It also had a very small and nimble frame, with 3 engines capable of thrust vectoring, making it far more maneuverable than its clone counterparts. This made it an absolute nightmare for clone pilots. This one droid platform single-handedly destroyed the Republic's confidence in the ARC-170 program and tarnished Incom Corporation's reputation with the Republic and later on the Empire. The Tri-Fighter's success demonstrates not only CCN's excellent design and engineering, but also their capability at programming droid brains. This is the one thing that really separated their products from more generic security droids and battle droids. CCN's products just behaved differently. They were fanatic and cunning when hunting down their enemies. This could be why their droid products were so terrifying to their enemies. It wasn't just about their aesthetics and their capabilities, it was about how ruthless and animalistic they operated, these droids. For instance, the Colicoids also had the Infiltrator series droid based off of the droidica platform as well. This thing was mostly designed for stealth infiltration and had a holographic cloaking device that allowed it to hide in plain sight. It was also equipped with 2 massive blades, which were terrific for tearing organic flesh. And the way they used these things was also very cunning and scary. They would basically launch these things in canisters at enemy ships. They would latch on, breach the hull, and then sneak around and kill off the entire crew one at a time. It's stuff like this that kept sailors up at night, nervously glancing at their hull with every odd, unexplained noise. Even more feared was the Pisoteca sabotage droid. While individually they weren't that dangerous, these tiny droids were usually deployed in large swarms. They kind of remind me of the Flood, actually, those little face-hugging bastards. You know, the infection forms, right? That's what they're called. Also known as the buzz droids, these things were usually launched out of a missile. Once they arrived on target, these droids would disperse themselves like a floating minefield. Whenever a ship was unlucky enough to pass pass by them, they would come out of their armored shells and attempt to latch onto the ship, and then they would use a variety of different cutting tools and drilling tools to do as much damage as possible to the ship. While more of a pest for larger vessels, for starfighters and smaller civilian vessels, these buzz droids could quickly cut through the exterior hull, venting the inside of the ship to vacuum, or they could destroy essential systems, which could strand the ship in the middle of nowhere. This is probably one of the scariest things a pilot could face, and after the Clone Wars, just like with minefields here on Earth, there were just fields of these things scattered all across the galaxy. And that's the genius of the Colicoid species. They didn't just seek to create weapons that were efficient at killing, they wanted to target the very psyche of the targets of these weapons. As such, they had several vehicles focused on breaching and exposing enemy ships to vacuum. Again, this is something that all organics fear when they're flying in space. You had the Drach-class boarding ship, which was another one of these crazy inventions. This was a transport ship whose main feature was 4 massive blades that could be used to latch onto the hull of an enemy ship, at which point the droids inside the Drach-class could perform a boarding action. What made the Drach-class boarding ship so deadly was they could breach an enemy ship at any location and bypass any setup defenses. The Trident-class assault ship had a very similar design purpose, but at a larger scale. It could rip a hole in the side of a massive capital ship with relative ease. These ships were shaped like terrifying squids, which adds to the horror factor of the vessel, and could be deployed in both deep space and also deep in the oceans. The Trident class had a variety of different stealth features, including a silent propulsion method that allowed them to reach their targets undetected before latching on and creating chaos. Not only were these type of vessels extremely hard to design and engineer, CCN actually developed all of these products independently from the wider scientific community in the galaxy. This is why very few Colicoid creation nest vehicles follow a traditional or standard approach to design. And in warfare, that is a huge advantage, to have an unorthodox design that's not only deadly, but very unpredictable. CCN had a variety of other lesser-known droids. They did actually build a humanoid droid known as the FLTC-8 series battle droid. It was quite deadly, but never gained the same popularity that other CCN products did. It was actually quite large and bulky. It was very deadly, but also very easy to spot. There's also the Hunter-Seeker droid Starfighter, which, like many Colicoid creation nest products, could be hidden in ball form and then unravel at the last minute into an almost Minoc-like droid Starfighter with a giant stinger tail equipped with a laser cannon. Again, it's all about concealment and then the element of surprise. The most standard thing that CCN built was the T4 turret droid, which was just a large 4-legged droid with different armaments built on top of it. The T4 was designed to be deployed in a stationary manner, usually behind prepared defenses. Colicoid creations nest might be owned by one of the most unpleasant alien species in the galaxy, but if you can get over your fear of them, if you can get over the fear of maybe a deal gone awry and then getting consumed by a bunch of alien insects who are curious about what you tasted like the second you walked in, you can gain access to some truly unique weapons designs that pretty much no one else in the galaxy had.
The other day I was sitting in traffic in my car and I looked around me and I saw maybe one Toyota Camry and then every make and brand you could possibly imagine, but these cars were all cut into the vaguely familiar shape of a crossover. I thought to myself, 20 years earlier, I'd be sitting in traffic surrounded by cars that were all about 6 inches lower to the ground, back when people all just drove sedans and not these little SUV things. There's been an arms race that was first started probably in the suburbs by scared drivers who wanted bigger and bigger cars so that they might feel safer on the highways. And now this arms race has reached every corner of this country and cars are bigger, higher off the ground, and in a lot of ways much worse to drive. Now, ever since I started riding, I've stopped caring so much about cars. They all seem kind of boring and similar in their design. But this was a really interesting kind of moment for me, seeing directly how consumer tastes have changed an entire industry and forced automobile makers to create something that consumers actually want. And I thought I'd take this kind of moment and apply it to the Star Wars galaxy and take a look at what kind of things makes a Starship manufacturer successful in the Star Wars galaxy. And I was actually pretty surprised by what I found. Basically, one company controls everything in the civilian ship market. Just like a lot of things in Star Wars, there's a monopoly. Now, usually on this channel, when we talk about Starship manufacturers, we're talking about military manufacturers. We talk about products made by Incom Corporation, like the Z95 the ARC 170, and of course the X-Wing. We even recently did a video about the E-Wing, which is created by the successor of Incom. There's also Sienar Fleet Systems, with its line of TIE fighters and large shipyards like Kuat Drive Yards, who most famously made the 25,000 Imperial-class Star Destroyers for the Imperial fleet. Which sounds like a lot, but the truth is military production numbers never even get close to civilian production numbers. I mean, take the Humvee, for instance, one of the most prolific American military vehicles ever designed. It's essentially an SUV that has many different uses, and it's been exported around the world to many different militaries. And more than 281,000 of these Humvees have been built. Now you think that's a lot, but let's take a look at this graphic here, which shows us the top 5 automobiles sold in the world in the first quarter, or first 3 months of 2023. As you can see, both Tesla and Toyota's strategy towards EV cars have paid off pretty well here. This basically means that Tesla and Toyota has sold as many of these models of cars within 3 months as the US military has sold Humvees in 30 years. Which is why in this video we won't be looking at another military Starship designer, but a civilian-focused one. And so when I ask you guys who manufactures the most civilian starships in the galaxy, the answer for you Star Wars nerds out there should be pretty easy. But I'll give you a hint. Remember in The Rise of Skywalker when Lando brings basically the entire galaxy to take on the Sith fleet at Exegol? Well, that fleet had a lot of freighters, and I guarantee the majority of those freighters came from Corellian Engineering Corporation. Corellian Engineering Corporation, since the beginning of the Republic, has maintained its position in the top 3 largest Starship manufacturers in the galaxy. And part of the reason why this company has dominated the market so long was due to Corellia itself. Located in the core regions, Corellia was one of the first planets settled after Coruscant. And despite being on friendly terms with the Republic for most of its history, Corellia has been fiercely independent, and the companies that emerged from Corellia are also fiercely independent. The planet of Corellia even had its own special treaties with the Republic that kind of made it different in how it interacted with the Republic compared to other member states. It's kind of like how the United Kingdom, when it was in the EU, used to have its own currency still available. It wasn't forced to adopt the European monetary union. This fierce Corellian independence was created out of a sense of importance and self-resiliency the system had. For instance, Corellia is placed in a pretty strange and rich system. To begin with, it has an abnormally high amount of habitable worlds. Known as the 5 Brothers, you have Corellia, Salonia, Dral, and then the twin worlds of Tralus and Talus. These planets are actually believed to have been moved there by massive hyperspace tractor beams created by the Celestials. Yes, the same Celestials that have been hinted about in the Ahsoka series recently. And during the age prior to the invention of the hyperdrive, when most starships could only travel at subspace speeds, it was really beneficial for Corellia to have so many habitable planets within the system. It allowed them to quickly expand and grow their population. It would also be the Corellians who reverse engineered the Rakatan hyperdrive and used it to connect the core worlds together. It was Corellian scouts who first ventured off into the unknown and started mapping many of the galaxy's major hyperspace routes. It's one of the major reasons why one of the most important trade lanes in the galaxy, the Corellian Run, goes right through the system. A combination of wealth, expertise, sense of adventure, and also all that experience knowing how important reliability is for a starship when you're just by yourself in the edges of the galaxy made Corellia the perfect place to start a ship company. While other shipyards like Kuat Drive Yards, Sienar Fleet Systems, and Incom would primarily focus on getting massive government contracts, CEC was always focused on doing its own thing and wasn't really affected by how other companies operated, and instead it would focus on the civilian market, as it gave them a bit more flexibility and quicker turnaround times for their projects. Now, of course, Corellian freighters are commonly used by military forces all throughout galactic history. The Gazanti-class cruiser is probably one of the most popular ships used by both the Empire and the Republic. But I think CEC's ferocious independence made it very wary of large governments and military forces, and what they didn't want was for a significant percentage of their sales going to a military or a government that could then apply political pressure to the brand.
They could use a good pilot like you. You're turning your back on them.
What good's the reward if you ain't around to use it? Besides, attacking that battle station ain't my idea of courage.
I would argue this is just typical Corellian behavior. They hate joining things. During the Military Creation Act, when Palpatine accepted the clone army and engaged the Separatists in the war, Corellia actually decided to stand on its own. They protested the move completely, and they even closed their borders. Which is probably why Corellia was completely occupied by the Empire afterwards and forced to build Star Destroyers. And these Star Destroyers were completely against the spirit of the CEC and its design philosophy. If you take a look at your basic Corellian freighter, it offers something very Corellian to its consumers, and that is complete freedom. They essentially give you a box that is structurally sound, has good engines and a life support system, and they basically allow you to fill that box with anything you want. Which is why when you mention Corellian Engineering Corporation, you also have to mention the massive third-party aftermarket support that this company gives. This allows captains to turn what should originally have been just another tugboat from an orbital shipyard into the Millennium Falcon.
It's a ship that made the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs.
It's like taking a Ford Econoline van and making it as fast as a Bugatti. It just doesn't happen often. But in the Star Wars galaxy, if you see a Corellian Engineering Corporation ship, it's very likely to happen. Now, most manufacturers who build things typically don't encourage aftermarket tinkering. Some make closed systems. Others use stupid proprietary tech to make it more difficult for people to add parts onto their products. But not Corellian Engineering Corporations. I feel like they would be kind of disappointed if you didn't modify their ships. I mean, even if you don't have the credits, at least add some fox fur seat covers to your cockpit seats. You know, give it a little bit of class. Come on. Take the Gazanti-class cruiser. It was so commonly modified that you actually had different officially recognized types of Gazanti-class cruisers, like the Imperial Gazanti-class cruiser, which is specifically designed to carry TIE fighters or AT-ATs. The Empire also had a special IGV-55 variant for Imperial intelligence and surveillance. The Empire also had an assault variant as well. You also have the Black Suns variant with extra hidden cargo spaces. You have the Sea Rock version, which was actually a midlife upgrade program for the Gazanti-class cruiser sold directly by CEC. Let me explain to you how crazy this is. Most vehicle manufacturers, they want to build their vehicles to not last forever. They want them to break down so that you eventually have to go out and get the new model year. For Corellian Engineering Corporation to literally create a mid-life upgrade program for these decades-old ships just shows you what their mentality and philosophy is. They're not looking for the quick buck. They want to make you a lifetime customer. The Sea Rock version featured more hull space and protection, along with 3 additional sublight engines, military-grade sensors, and ordnance launchers. Now you're probably wondering here, who is the audience for the Sea Rock upgrade? Well, there's actually another upgrade to the already upgraded Sea Rock version. It's called the Koensayr refit. So, you know, as you would imagine, a lot of pirates basically really like this redesign and would use this for piracy. It's a real testament to CEC's open-minded marketing strategy that you have basically a bunch of militant fascists using the same ship that is also preferred by anarchy-loving pirates. The Gazanti-class cruiser is probably the only ship that fought in both the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War, but on both sides of the conflict. Heck, this ship probably even fought in the Resistance First Order War. This shows us that Corellian Engineering really does care first and foremost about their products, and they rely on their customer satisfaction to continue growing their brand and maintain their dominance in the markets. I know it's groundbreaking, right? Who would have assumed that consumers really like products that are well designed, that can last for a really long time and also be modified? Who would have known that they didn't want hidden fees and subscriptions and paywalls on their ship for pieces of equipment they thought they already owned? This is why when Harrison Dula decided to choose a ship to base her Spectre cell out of, she chose a VCX-100 light freighter. It doesn't really stand out in the hyperspace lanes, but with a bit of tweaking, you have a ship that is as agile as a starfighter, plus it even has a small hyperdrive-equipped shuttle as well that gives you tons of flexibility. This is why when Mark Matten founded Iron Squadron and decided to challenge the Empire on Mikapo, he used an old YT-2400 light freighter. While not as famous as the YT-1300 popularized by Han Solo in the Millennium Falcon, every ship on the YT line has the ability to carry a ridiculous amount of cargo. I'm talking about more cargo than they could actually store internally on the vessel, which is why the YT series is really good at external hardpoints for freight. Which is why Iron Squadron used improvised bombs placed inside said shipping containers. Not only do these containers provide a cheap alternative to weapons-grade munitions, you can also fit a lot more explosive in these crates than you could in a missile. Now, it's not just the modularity that makes CEC ships so popular, that's one aspect. The other thing is they're just really affordable. Take the Gazanti-class cruiser, for instance. It's just around 200,000 credits in price. That's basically the same price as 3 TIE fighters. Better yet, compare the Gazanti-class cruiser to the Archidans light cruiser or the Imperial light cruiser, which costs 5 million credits, then you see what kind of savings you're getting here. And yes, one Archidans class command cruiser can definitely take out one Gazanti class cruiser, but can it take out 25 Gazanti class cruisers? Because that's how many you could buy. with the same money you could buy for that light Imperial cruiser. Better yet, take a look at the CR90 Corvette from CEC. It's around 150 meters in length compared to the Arkadin's 230 meters in length. The CR90 costs just 1.2 million credits, or about 1/4 the price of the Kuat Drive Yard's product. If you take a look at the Republic era, while they used a lot of Kuat Drive Yard ships towards the end during the Clone Wars, for centuries, the Republic Judicial Forces and Diplomatic Corps would actually rely on Corellian ships. And that's because they weren't just known for being modular and good value, they also were known for having extremely solid frames and also very powerful and reliable engines. The Koensayr-class cruiser from CEC, for instance, was one of the main ships used by Jedi diplomats and judicials, and it actually had 0 weapons on board. The red paint on the surface of this ship represents its diplomatic immunity, but it's actually the massive thrusters on the back that kept it safe and out of the reach of enemy weapons. Corellian Engineering Corporation vessels are not necessarily designed for war, but they are very rugged and fast, which allows you to avoid most tense situations that you would find in the hyperspace lanes. Take the CR90 Corvette, for instance, one of the most commonly used vessels in the Rebel Alliance Navy. The CR90 Corvette started out life during the Clone Wars as a diplomatic vessel, and thanks to its massive bank of engines, it was actually classified as a blockade runner. Overall, the design of Corellian Engineering Corporation vessels is not going to wow your average civilian. It's not going to wow individuals who, I guess, lack the creativity to design or want to design their own ship. This is not a company that sells its brand as a lifestyle or something that can make you happy. The CEC line of freighters is not a status symbol. Instead, it's a ship company run by pilots and captains themselves, and they are deadly serious about making a good ship. And we're not just talking about any captains, we're talking about Corellian captains, the most fiercely independent individuals out there on the hyperspace lanes. It's a company that understands that the value it gives to the consumer comes solely from the design of the vessel, and that after a person purchases their product, it's theirs to keep and modify 100%. Now, this video is not sponsored by Corellian Engineering Corporation, although they probably should reach out to me. But if you are in the market for a freighter, I could think of no finer company than this one right here.
Today's manufacturer is a lot smaller scale in how many ships they produce, and more importantly, they're a state-sponsored and owned Starship manufacturing company, and they make some of the most beautiful starships I've ever seen for some of the most important political figures of their time. And the story behind them is quite interesting and perhaps also a cautionary tale. Today we'll be talking about Theed Palace Engineering Corps. And now you can't invest your credits into them because they wouldn't want them anyway, because they most likely are an elaborate psyop for the Naboo monarchy. Unlike most of the other companies we've covered so far, Theed Hangars, as it was also known by locals, is not a company burdened by generating revenue, marketing new ships, or even designing them for a wider consumer base. This firm does not have to navigate the complex political realities of being a defense manufacturer. They don't have to worry about which side of a war they have to sell their ship to. And that is essentially because they have one client, a client that also gives them their budget, and that is the Theed Royal Palace that governs over all of Naboo. And having just one customer to please, Theed Palace engineers really only have to focus on a few set of things, creating high-performance luxury ships that were both aesthetically pleasing but also environmentally friendly. And the reason behind all of this is perhaps a bit darker than a 10-year-old version of myself realized when I first saw The Phantom Menace in theaters. Yippee! Most people's perception of Naboo comes from the extremely famous holodrama known as the Skywalker Saga. One of the main heroines in this story is Queen Padme Amidala, the youngest monarch in the planet's history. And it's through her eyes that we get to see Naboo for the first time. We get to tour Naboo's grand palaces, we get to see its grand avenues, and classic High Republic architecture. In one of the first entries in the Skywalker Saga, we're told a brief history of the Naboo's struggle against the Trade Federation, who brutally blockaded the planet and occupied Theed City's pristine streets with their droid armies. We learn about the noble, yet very simple-minded and savage Gungans, who joined forces with the humans in Naboo, and together, as a unified force, they managed to liberate their planet, under human leadership, of course. Padme even gives the Gungans a shiny ball to commemorate the sacrifice of hundreds of Gungan warriors who died heroically in what really was a diversionary attack 40 kilometers outside of the city to buy the humans more time to carry out their own operation. That's a story that most of us knew, especially people in my generation who were, kids basically. We didn't really question much, but if you just look a little closer at the story, a lot of things just don't add up. What if
if I told you that Theed Palace Engineering Corps' main purpose was to support the extremely elegant and pristine image of the Naboo monarchy? What if I told you that this image was designed to misdirect people and hide the monarchy's more controversial past? Take a look at the Naboo Royal Starship, a J-Type 327 Nubian vessel. This is what most monarchs use for state visits. Its shape and design clearly harkens to the High Republic era of culture, and a philosophy of combining natural aesthetic beauty with technological excellence. The exterior of the ship was made out of, get this, handcrafted and hand-polished royal chromium. I mean, there was a reason why Rolls-Royce used to be the pinnacle of automobile luxury, and that's because outside of the chassis, those cars were mostly hand-assembled, and many of the pieces were actually handcrafted and hand-built, especially the wood finishes. In the Star Wars galaxy, where automation and assembly lines are able to produce anything from battle droids to massive star destroyers in bulk quantity, to have a hand-built starship company is complete insanity. I mean, this is why TPEC, which is what we'll be calling this company for the rest of the video, is essentially the Rolls-Royce of the Star Wars galaxy. But in a much crazier way, because this is a starship and the engineering tolerances for failures in space are quite minimal, and to get human craftsmanship to match the perfection of an automated manufacturing system is going to cost you a lot of money and work hours. Now, chromium is not only a beautiful metal to look at, it's extremely expensive, and it's also a metal with a lot of unique properties. Stainless steel is an iron chromium alloy which increases resistance to rust, corrosion, extra bonus points if you can guess what kind of helicopter that is. Stainless steel, which most of us have in our houses or in our cars, is an iron chromium alloy, which increases iron's resistance to rust, corrosion, and also gives it a higher heat tolerance. The chromium alloy plating used on TPEC's Royal yachts give a natural heat resistance layer to the ship that is very effective against energy-based small arms fire and even larger ship-based weapons. It gives a lot more protection than just regular Durasteel found on most military ships. So why don't more ships use this coating? Well, it's extremely expensive, and no one is paying for, hand-assembled, hand-polished, hand-crafted chromium plating for their starships. It's really the ultimate flex from a manufacturing, aesthetic, design, and defense point of view. And this is quite strange considering Naboo's pacifist and relatively isolated status in the galaxy. I mean, think about it. What other planets have a publicly funded custom starship manufacturing firm that builds these types of ridiculous ships? That's something you would expect from a dictator or a petrostate, but not from the elected monarch of a supposed democracy. And while Theed is an extremely beautiful city, the planet is hardly known as a rich or prosperous world. It's pretty underdeveloped. There's only a population of around 4.5 billion people here, and it's also in the mid-rim, which is not in the middle of anything. It's more on the peripherals. It's the next ring to the outer rim. And out of that population of 4.5 billion, only 1.2 billion lived on the surface of the planet, on Naboo's calm and peaceful plains and mountain ranges, where there was plenty of fertile soil and easy to domesticate livestock like the gentle shock. Now, what the Naboo monarchy doesn't want people to know, or just didn't know themselves, was that the rest of the population, the Gungans, lived mostly in hidden cities beneath the oceans, amongst the many terrifying and vicious monsters of the seas like the Sando Aqua Monster or the Opie Sea Killer. We could dig a little deeper and ask why, these air-breathing Gungans were forced to live in such a dangerous part of the world in these underwater cities. We could also ask why the Naboo didn't know about them, like the Harkonians didn't know about the Freemen on Arrakis. It's all kind of sketchy. But no, that would involve chartering a flight out to the mid-rim territories where no one really wants to go. And so instead, journalists wrote fluff pieces about the Naboo monarchy when they came to visit Coruscant, where they can completely control their image and what they showed to the public. And the HoloNet journalists in the Corps bought into everything that the Naboo presented to them, whether it was Queen Amidala's ridiculous headpieces or her fantastic dresses. But what impressed everyone more than anything was TPEC's many unique yachts. And as these ships glided to the surface, people were always reminded that these ships featured some of the cleanest plasma-burning engines in the galaxy that does not spew toxins and clouds of black dust in the air so you can better see your own reflection on its fantastically polished chromium-plated hulls. Because that's the whole idea behind royalty, isn't it? They wow us with their riches, immense wealth, so that maybe we'll bend knee and obey their orders. That's the whole idea behind luxury. Luxury
is designed to give people inspiration and dreams. Maybe if you work hard enough, one day you can buy this Louis Vuitton bag. But look closely at who buys Louis Vuitton. It's not really rich people. Oftentimes it's middle-class people. Other people spend like a month's salary purchasing things that they really shouldn't be doing. If you look at truly rich people, they don't buy stuff like that at all. And when you step aboard the Naboo Royal Starship, the illusion doesn't end there. As a matter of fact, the interior is even more luxurious. And if you are lucky enough to be granted an audience with the Queen, you don't get to sit next to her in a common room, like on most Republic diplomatic vessels around a circular table with a couch. Instead, you enter a freaking throne room, where the Queen holds an audience for you. I mean, it's one thing for a Queen in her palace to go from her living quarters to a throne room where she has a scheduled window of time where she meets with other people. That makes sense, okay? You want a designated place in your massive palace for meetings, okay. But if you're on a 76-meter long ship, which is quite small if you have your royal attachment attendant and crew members on board, why not keep it more casual? I mean, meet in the common room. Why such pomp and circumstance? What's even weirder is the Queen actually has to sit in this throne room during the entire flight, most likely so she doesn't bump into other people. It's just all really strange. I mean, why do this? Why have a monarch in the first place? It's designed to create an aura, to trick the masses into believing that this person is somehow better, above, the corruption and desires of the average man or woman. It's kind of like how Mr. Beast surrounds himself with the aura of being this philanthropist who loves giving away money to people. So what are the Naboo hiding with all that chrome and elegance? The establishment of TPEC is weird for a variety of different reasons that we mentioned before, but its creation also coincided with a huge economic and political shift on this planet, which is important. For most of its history, Naboo was mainly an agricultural planet with some artisanal craft cottage industries here and there. The planet wasn't necessarily isolationist, but the people's culture and its focus on art, beauty, and harmony, along with a lack of resources and any advanced industry or economic development, meant that most of the galaxy just left Naboo alone. It wasn't interesting, there weren't opportunities here. This is also why TPEC, when it was founded, attracted some of the brightest and most ambitious individuals on Naboo. It was also an honor to serve the monarch. But the reason why Naboo could fund such a high-end starship manufacturing company was because Naboo actually became a petrostate after the discovery of massive plasma deposits beneath the surface of the planet, where the Gungans lived. But here's the thing, the Naboo lacked the funding they needed to carry out the type of operation that they wanted to create. And so they ended up contracting the Trade Federation to start building a mining operation and also a large interstellar spaceport for the export of plasma. Now, if the Naboo just wanted to mine enough plasma resources for their own domestic consumption to remain, energy independent, they could have just done it themselves. I mean, the Gungans clearly had their own processes to extract the energy resource and used it for the majority of their technology. But the Naboo wanted to export this extremely high-quality energy, which could be used for specialized types of ships or industrial purposes. This plasma could definitely fetch a very high price on the market. But plasma mining is a risky venture, especially if you don't have the right infrastructure and skills to exploit said resources. The Star Wars energy market is extremely competitive, and for Naboo to even stand a chance of exporting any of their product, which they would have to store until they actually can export, they would have to scale their operation up to such a size where they could still make enough money by lowering the price of this energy. And this would all be impossible without capital investment. So the other way they could do this would be to slowly build up their operation, but they would probably have to take on a lot of debt in order to even fund these first kind of business ventures. And ultimately, this would lead to kind of a cycle of debt and a lack of production, and they most likely would never get their export business off the ground. The Trade Federation, with its expertise and connections and huge fleets of vessels and engineers, more or less guaranteed that a plasma mining operation could be profitable within a few years. Now, there were competing political factions on Naboo, including an isolationist, xenophobic bloc, which Queen Amidala's predecessor, San Anadrasa, actually supported. But they were quickly defeated by the pro-development bloc, which a young Palpatine actually supported. Let's not forget that he played a role in this as well. Now, both of these political blocs had good and bad people. You had people on the isolationist side who were more worried about the natural beauty of the planet, who didn't want what was truly a sketchy company being involved in resource extraction on the planet. You also had xenophobic people who just were against outsiders coming to Naboo, even though this planet clearly needed more development and more capital for it to become a more successful planet. You also had people on the development block that were kind of evil as well, like Palpatine. Palpatine actually joined the pro-development block to rebel against his father, who was more of an isolationist. But yeah, there were also individuals like Padme Amidala who wanted to create more political connections with other planets in the Chalma sector, to create more political unity and trade, which is obviously a good thing. What is clear, though, is the windfall from plasma extraction is ultimately why Naboo could afford a state-of-the-art shipbuilding firm like TPEC. Now, this plasma, as we mentioned, was exceptionally pure and produced very low emissions, but this was completely greenwashing the fact that such operations were made without consent from the Gungans. But the Naboo completely glossed over the fact that they were the ones responsible for bringing the Trade Federation over to the planet when they convinced the Gungans to send thousands of their warriors with primitive weapons to fight a modern army of battle droids out in the open. I mean, it's clear that the Gungans would have fared far better attacking the Separatist droid army in guerrilla-style attacks in the swamplands, in the forest, or even underwater. But Queen Amidala, focused more on the well-being of her own people, urged the Gungans to quickly present themselves out in the open in the midst of the Great Plains, where their troops stood little chance of winning in an almost Napoleonic style of battle. It's clear that the Trade Federation was only here because of Naboo's greed. It's clear that hundreds of Gungan warriors died because of Naboo's greed. And what's worse, the Gungans didn't even profit out of this at all, outside of that shiny ball that Amidala grants their leader. I mean, honestly, if you think about it, the Gungans would have fared a lot better if they just let the Trade Federation wipe out the Naboo. And then they could have just emerged later on and took over their planet by themselves. And just how rich did plasma make Naboo? I mean, take a look at TPEC's most famous product, the N1 Starfighter. And these weren't just mass-produced, off-the-shelf kind of components. Nubian Star Drive only built custom parts for very wealthy clients, which Naboo clearly was. And what TPEC got was the J-type engine, which could be upscaled or downscaled and used in various projects. And these engines tended to burn fuel at an extremely high temperature, which meant less particulates made it out of the exhaust. That, along with Naboo's pure plasma, made the J-type one of the cleanest burning engines in the galaxy. The N1 Starfighter, despite being designed during the pre-Clone Wars era, was extremely advanced for its time. Its engines gave it incredibly fast sublight speeds, and it was equipped with a Class 1 hyperdrive, which was simply unheard of at the time, and also kind of unnecessary for a planetary defense force, although these N1s did usually escort other TPEC yachts on longer missions. The ship also had an astromech slot for a droid along with twin blaster cannons and prototype torpedoes. And generally, starfighters were extremely robust, especially when you consider what Naboo's defense needs were. Now, perhaps on another day, we can get a bit deeper into Naboo's history and political system. As an investor in the Galactic Stock Exchange, if you want to survive, if you want to make it long-term and not zero out, if you want to build capital, there's only really one way of investing. It's not through speculation. I mean, I think like 90% of day traders eventually zero out. A lot of people focus on making the big bucks when really you want to just stay in the market as long as you can without having any big losses. If you can limit your losses, you ultimately will win. And the best way to do that is really doing research. It's not just trying to price companies or see where the trends are. It's about understanding the companies themselves. And while TPEC will never be publicly traded, this is a great thought exercise at looking at how companies operate. And there are going to be a lot of companies out there in the world that are going to look sketchy. The products, the finances just don't add up. You'll see that they have a weird customer base, or that they just are in a market that they shouldn't belong to. And usually those are big signs that this company is either scamming people or trying to cover up someone, like the Naboo monarchy in this case. And this is not going to be a safe place to put your hard-earned money. And so no matter how many crazy people on the financial holonets tell you to buy, only trust your own research or individuals, analysts that you have already vetted and understand what exactly their process is. If a company doesn't have true value, it doesn't matter how glossy their ships are or how high their stock price is, because usually in 95% of those situations, what's being sold is just hot air.
When it comes to Mandalorians, a lot of attention is placed on their armor and the weapons they bring into combat. But what a lot of fans don't realize is that Mandalorians take that same fanatic attention to detail that they put into their designs for their personal gear and extend that across all of the stuff they make. That includes larger vehicles, cakes, and of course, starships. And that makes sense. You know, if a helmet or a blaster malfunctions in the middle of a battle, it's not great, but it's not the end of the world. But when your starship breaks apart while it's flying through hyperspace, well, that's a big problem. Hundreds of years before the Galactic Civil War even started, an outfit known as MandalMotors was founded by a Mandalorian super commando and also general known as Gustav Zenlaw. Gustav Zenlaw was a very colorful character. He carried all of his stories and experiences with him pockmarked onto his armor. He'd seen quite a lot of action and fighting in his years in the Mandalorian army and also as a mercenary. But his true calling in life was not just fighting, but design. And since he was a Mandalorian, that meant designing weapons, vehicles, and other things that killed things. And, you know, Zenlaw was a really crazy designer. He created something called the Wing Blast Rocket Pack, which was less of a rocket pack and more like a giant mech suit. It was not only capable of atmospheric flight, it could actually fly into space, like for really long journeys through subspace from one planet to another. If you feel like there's no market for such a thing, well, you just don't know Mandalorians well enough. Guys like Paz Vizsla would have loved this thing. Rest in peace, ya big old bug. And because this was a Mandalorian designed jetpack, well, it had a Gatling blasters on it, concussion missiles, and also a proton torpedo launcher, which is just, it's just overkill. I mean, it's also overkill that the Mandalorians would actually want to fly from one system to another in just a suit of armor. That's how much they like their Beskar, I guess. So why am I telling you about this one specific design? Well, I want to give you a better sense of who Zenlaw was and what kind of company he would establish. They'd be kind of over top with their designs. MandalMotors were kind of like the German luxury automakers of the Star Wars galaxy. And no, I'm not referencing all the genocides that MandalMotor vehicles have taken part of. I'm more talking about their tendency to over-design their products with way too many features. MandalMotors became a source of pride for the Mandalorians. Not only did its vehicles and starships fit Mandalorian tastes, the company also brought great economic growth to the entire planet. And this has a lot to do with the fact that MandalMotors was a politically neutral company, as in they didn't care who bought their products as long as they had credits with them. That really does run counter to how Mandalorians jealously guard some of their other pieces of equipment.
If you want my armor, you'll have to peel it off my dead body.
In many ways, MandalMotors represented a different future for the Mandalorian people. Instead of just serving as the galaxy's bounty hunters and muscle, they could have also been known for producing excellent equipment and warships, which I think in the long run would have been much better for the Mandalorian people. Now, before we continue, a quick word from our sponsor. For today's video, Ownersaber.com. They make beauties like this thing right here. Ownersaber.com is the premier shop for all of your lightsaber needs. November is here and they're rolling out their Black Friday monthly special. Buy any replica category blade and you can get a free Padawan saber. Simply add both to the cart and their system will automatically make the Padawan blade free. This offer runs from November 1st to November 30th. I personally have had my eyes on the Malgus. Yes, you guys remember that brute of a Sith Lord from the old Republic era. His lightsaber hilt has two blade-shaped guards, which kind of makes the weapon look more like an entrenching tool of some kind. Makes it useful even when the emitter is broken in combat. And you can pair that with the less serious looking last brick, which is always a great conversation starter. Check out that lightsaber and many more in the description down below. Thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. Two of my favorite models that MandalMotors produces are the Fang class starfighter and the Carmrick class fighter. The Fang class was co-developed by MandalMotors and Sub corporations. Sub was a much larger corporation located on Solston. It was backed by the Commerce Guild and had tons of R&D experience for a wide range of products and had been operating for thousands of years. Sub was the pride of the Solston people, just like MandalMotors was the pride of the Mandalorian, just like Kia and Hyundai are the pride of the Korean people. And so this wasn't just a cooperation between two corporations, it was a collaboration between two peoples who also seemed to be really interested in forging various metals and designing warships. And so this was a really great diplomatic venture as well. I mean, the result is, in my opinion, one of the best starfighters in the galaxy, the Fang Fighter. It boasts one of the more ambitious Mandalorian designs, with excellent Solston-style execution and manufacturing expertise. This was an extremely fast and highly maneuverable fighter. During the Galactic Civil War, in a minor skirmish, a squadron of Fang-class fighters were able to take on a similar-sized Rebel A-Wing squadron. The A-Wing interceptor from Kuat Systems Engineering had no equals during the Galactic Civil War when it came to straight-line speeds. The Empire rolled out multiple fighters in order to combat its blistering speed and never found anything suitable. To make matters even more impressive, one of those A-Wings was being piloted by the ace Harrison Dula. During the battle, every single A-Wing would be destroyed except for one that managed to jump into hyperspace. The Mandalorians, on the other hand, didn't suffer any casualties. Granted, these were Mandalorian protectors who flew the Fang-class fighters. They were very well trained, and they also had gotten a jump on their competition. Regardless, it was still a very impressive showing. The Mandalorian protectors trained Fenn Rau and had plenty of experience with these craft. They'd actually flown these ships during the Clone Wars, and during the Third Battle of Megiddo, they actually relieved Jedi forces under the command of Deepa Philippe and Caleb Dume. Well, actually, they saved them. The Fang fighter is featured an aggressive but also streamlined and elegant fuselage, combining pleasing aesthetics with a very functional profile. The S-foils on the fighter were able to rotate around the body, making it a bit more confusing for enemies to target. Each S-foil also had an ion engine that was capable of thrust vectoring, which is probably why this ship is so ridiculously agile. Like a lot of Mandalorian gear, the Fang fighter was extremely robust, and its very thin and knife-like profile made it exceptionally skilled at frontal attacks, and that's because it's very hard for enemy fighters to actually hit it. At just 6 meters in length, this was quite a small ship, but still large enough to hold a proton torpedo launcher and a Class 2 hyperdrive. After the Rebels and Mandalorians found a common cause together in their fight against the Empire, the Fang fighter was even adopted in small amounts by the Rebellion. The ship would play a crucial role in freeing the Rebel fleet from Thrawn at the Battle of Atollon. Heck, we even see Fang fighters active in 35 ABY and Lando Calrissian's civilian fleet during the battle over Exegol. That means 50 years of continuous service, which is really not that shabby for a combat airframe. Also, I gotta say that a lot of these Mandalorian ships seem to have survived from the Clone Wars all the way to First Order Resistance War. Just shows you the quality of these ships. Next up, we have the larger cousin of the Fang-class fighter, the Cormac-class transport fighter. This beautiful ship was oftentimes escorted by Fang-class fighters, and it really does defy any class designation. The closest airframe I would relate it to would be maybe the U-Wing or the TIE Striker. These crafts are all large enough to transport an assault squad onto the battlefield, and they also have enough maneuverability that they can survive without escort fighters if need be. What made the Cormac class very different and uniquely suited for the Mandalorians' need was their unique passenger compartment that allowed Mandalorian jetpack commandos to deploy while in mid-flight. This severely limits hover time and deployment time of a Mandalorian assault squad, which is an extremely dangerous part of any military operation or insertion. But unlike other dropships like the LAAT or a Lambda-class shuttle, the Cormac class is a legitimate fighter as well. Sure, it trades some of its speed and maneuverability for its larger size. At 68 meters in length, it's more than twice as long as both the U-Wing and the TIE Reaper. But I would argue it's actually far more deadly in a dogfight. Armed with the same rotating foil around the chassis, the Cormac, which also had thrust vectoring capabilities, was surprisingly nimble for its size and oftentimes surprised enemy fighter pilots. On top of that, it could carry a full Mandalorian platoon, 24 commandos, into combat. That's 3 times more than a U-Wing could carry and 2 times more than a TIE Reaper. This is an extremely potent craft, and it was heavily armed. It had 2 forward-facing laser cannons and 2 rear-facing laser cannons, along with heat-seeking missiles. It's this overkill that made it the preferred ship for organizations like Death Watch and Bo-Katan's Night Owls, who often needed quick and reliable transportation and liked to fight outnumbered and under heavy fire. Next up, we have what I like to call the Mandalorian Flying Toaster, otherwise known as the Pursuer-class enforcement ship. It kind of looks like a dumb ship, but in Legends, Boba Fett actually piloted this craft after losing the Slave One. Like the other Mandalorian ships we've covered so far, the Pursuer was exceptionally well equipped for its size. It had twin blaster cannons along with a turret-mounted ion cannon for disabling enemy ships, essential systems, and military-grade shields. The Pursuer was quite popular amongst the Mandalorian protectors during the Clone Wars, along with the Fang fighter, and it was also commonly used by Mandalorian law enforcement. Then there's the HH-87 Starhopper, a surprisingly aerodynamic-looking starfighter at just 6.8 meters in length. This was quite a small craft, but looked a lot bulkier thanks to the additional armored plating and aggressive prow at the front of the ship. It portrays that classic Mandalorian aggression that a lot of non-Mandalorians really like for their ships, and this specific model is actually designed for long-range travel. You can compare it to the ARC-175 from Incom, used by the Galactic Republic. Equipped with 2 laser cannons, the HH-87 was designed for long-range patrols and was specifically targeted towards Outer Rim factions, specifically underworld outer rim factions. The HH-87 would become the preferred starship of the Hutt cartels and also the Zagarian slave empire. While quite formidable compared to the usual outer rim PDF fighter or civilian ship, when the HH-87 went up against more formidable military-grade vessels like the Z-95 Headhunter, it didn't really stand a chance. The Hutts also enjoyed employing the M3A Psyche, which in my opinion was sort of like a budget Fang-class fighter. It was equipped with concussion missiles or proton torpedoes, twin light laser cannons or ion cannons, and had a Class 2 hyperdrive and basic shielding. It was a pretty cheap design. It's very similar to the TIE Fighter in its capabilities, but what the Hutts really liked about this design was the fact that its weapons mount could accept basically any type of weapon you wanted to mount on it. Both the M3 and the HH-87 were an example of MandalMotors attempting to break into new markets. Both of these ships were cheaper and less robust mainline ships. I don't think a Mandalorian Super Commando would actually fly one of these things, but they were perfect for the underserved criminal underworld that Mandalorians routinely had contact with. This shows us that MandalMotors is far less regressive and traditional than the rest of Mandalorian society. They are able and willing to make decisions based on business needs, and they're able to diversify their clientele so that they can survive in the long term as a company. Next up, we have the Lancer-class pursuit craft. As you can tell, the Mandalorians developed quite a lot of security vessels. This one was commonly utilized by bounty hunters and also law enforcement. I believe the Black Sun criminal cartel also bought a bulk shipment of these vessels. At 34 meters in length, this was a larger vessel, about the same size as a small freighter like the Millennium Falcon, but it was actually properly equipped for a security role from the factory. The ship had a Class 2 hyperdrive, a dorsal-mounted triple laser cannon, a forward-mounted twin light laser cannon, and a ventral-mounted tractor beam projector for stopping criminal ships. The Lancer was built to be fast, tough, and very low maintenance. This was perfect for bush pilots in the Outer Rim who didn't really have access to the best service all the time. The Lancer was also really modular, kind of like CEC freighters, although the design itself was actually based off a Soro sub freighter and not a Corellian freighter. And this just shows us another cooperation between the Mandalorians and the Sulstan people. These ships were actually very common in the peripherals of the galaxy. We actually see one in Andor in the Ferric shipyard, which made me geek out a little bit. Asajj Ventress would also utilize a Lancer after her fall from grace and stint as a bounty hunter. Sabrina Wren's old bounty hunting pal Ketsu Onyo would also pilot the Lancer patrol craft as well. Lastly, we have the Akajor class shuttle, a transport designed specifically for the new Mandalorians. Built with the same rotating wings design that the Karmic fighter/transports had, the Akajor was unarmed and not equipped with a hyperdrive. You see, the new Mandalorians were pacifists in nature. Although some young Mandalorians like to bolt on, weapons onto their craft using aftermarket parts, this really shows us that MandalMotors was willing to fit their clientele's needs, and that includes building a ship without weapons, which seems very anti-Mandalorian, but again, these guys were focused on profit and making their business sustainable. The Mandalorian Guard would utilize these unarmed shuttles to fly around the Mandalorian system and carry out their security duties. So there you have it, guys. MandalMotors, one of the more interesting medium-sized shipbuilders in the galaxy. While we talk a lot about, larger outfits like Kuat Systems Engineering, Incom, Sienar Fleet Systems, Soro Sub, it's these medium-sized shipyards that are extremely important to the overall health of the shipbuilding industry. It's in these medium-sized companies that we see the most innovation, the most risk-taking, and also just the most creative designs. The sad thing is, due to the events that occurred on Mandalore during the Imperial era, including the Great Purge of Mandalore, we're not really sure about the state of MandalMotors. In Legends, MandalMotors survives the Galactic Civil War, and there's actually a resurgence in the company's ability to make a profit once a large load of Beskar is found on the planet of Mandalore. But we don't really know what happens in canon yet. We do know that the company still exists to a certain extent. It is possible that all the vessels we see now, like Lady Katan's Karmic-class fighters and all the Mandalorian ships that take part in the Resistance First Order War, are now amongst the last of their kind. And so they've all become collector pieces and antiques, which I guess is kind of cool and also sad. Here on this channel, we love introducing new lore and concepts within the Star Wars universe. But every now and then we also like to introduce to our fans, especially those who live in universe, insight on the economic infrastructure that keeps the Star Wars galaxy running smoothly. For instance, you might be curious about how that Ewok jerky in your corner grocery store in Coruscant got there. Is it actually organic and killed without pesticides? Are Ewoks sentient beings, and is it ethical to eat sentient things? Yeah. There's actually quite a lot of steps and players involved in the Ewok jerky supply chain, and it's just one small delicious part of the larger galactic economy. A hectic, sprawling mess that spans most of the known galaxy. But Steve, if you were to come up to me and ask me, hey, what should I do with my hard-earned galactic credits that you pillaged from some poor alien homesteader in the Outer Rim, I would steer you away from commodities like Ewok jerky. I mean, the Ewok price boom after the Battle of Endor is not something you or I can predict. And speculation leads to the dark side, so instead I would suggest a company that is so intertwined with the runnings of the galaxy that it could never fail. A company like Kuat. While alien meat prices will rise and fall with galactic events and tastes, there will always be a huge need for starships in the galaxy, and no one is better suited for that task than Kuat Drive Yards. This is a company and a planet that is too large to fail. And while speculation, regime change, and federal policies will alter the day-to-day share prices of KDY, ultimately the assets that this planetary shipyard holds will probably never change. The only threat against such a company is perhaps the Death Star, but not even Wilhelm Tarkin is ballsy enough to mess with the Kuwati. And so today we're going to be taking a look at why Kuat Drive Yards is a really solid choice for a lot of you value investors out there looking to get sustainable and continuous growth on your portfolios. Also, guys, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our investment advice. Did you guys know that Samsung is responsible for almost 15% of Korea's total GDP? Did you know that Amazon controls about 50% of America's e-commerce retail market? When you have a monopoly over a certain industry in a country, when you provide billions of dollars of tax revenue and hundreds of thousands of jobs, the government of those countries will undoubtedly be inclined to assist and give you special treatment. While some measures, like protectionism, which is what the United States gave to Harley-Davidson for decades, will ultimately harm companies, it does give investors some peace of mind that the federal government is going to bat for your company. Kuat Drive Yards is not only the largest company on the planet of Kuat, it essentially is Kuat. One does not exist without the other. You see, in the early days of the Galactic Republic, tens of thousands of years before the Galactic Civil War, a group of merchants, most likely from Coruscant, wanted to build the best and largest and most efficient shipyard in the core. These individuals, known as the 10, would hire terraformers to change the planet of Kuat into a luxurious paradise world. It had a perfectly balanced ecosystem full of tropical islands, lush forests, and a balanced weather system with cool, wet winters and warm, dry summers. On top of that, no hostile life form were stocked onto the planet, which means that Kuat definitely would not harbor any dolphins. At the same time, over the planet, a massive orbital ring was being built in zero gravity. This would significantly reduce the cost of building and launching ships into space. This was all a part of the appeal of Kuat Drive Yards. Other worlds like Ringo Vinda would attempt to copy such a design, but Kuat Drive Yards pioneered the orbital shipyard concept, and theirs would be the largest and most efficient for the rest of galactic history. Now, while KDY was under construction, all of the other competitors in the industry would try to sabotage the company's dealings, either through legal measures or very illicit, hostile kind of actions. But their attempts only united the Kuat 10 more in pursuing their dream of dominating the shipbuilding industry. And so the 10 families would eventually sign the inheritance exemption. This was a document that would give the 10 families of Kuat permanent control over KDY and its manufacturing facilities. It would also create bylaws which would settle any interpersonal disputes between the families and allow for stability to rule over Kuat for the rest of galactic history. At first, KDY was not a major player in the galaxy. At the time, there were 3 large shipbuilding companies. You had Core Galaxy Systems, Corellian Star Drive, and Hoersch and Kessel Drive Inc. KDY would target Core Galaxy Systems first because it held on to a very lucrative contract to provide capital ships to the Republic. Using pricing wars, industrial espionage, and other less than legal methods, KDY would eventually destroy Core Galaxy Systems' ability to compete and would eventually buy them out. At the same time, Corellian Star Drive's entire senior design team was killed in a shuttle accident, and so the top 3 shipbuilding manufacturers in the galaxy would be KDY, Korean Engineering Corporation, and Hoersch and Kessel Drive Inc. When the Rusan Reformation occurred, not only did it disband the federal military, it also put severe limitations on what type of capital ships and military ships could be built in the galaxy. And so if your company mainly relies on military contracts, you're going to have some issues when the political climate changes like this. Luckily, Kuat Drive Yard's leaders were always looking to diversify their holdings. Kuat Drive Yards would eventually purchase many smaller specialized shipyards and also expand their facilities off-world to new planets. KDY would eventually start launching subsidiary companies to meet specific needs and demands. For instance, Rothana Heavy Engineering was where KDY would keep some of their more secretive product lines. When the clone army was being covertly created, KDY would use Rothana Heavy Engineering to produce vehicles for the GAR away from the prying eyes of Republic officials. KDY would also create Ubrikian Industries, which specifically built transport vessels for both the civilian and military markets. Kuat Leisure focused on civilian vessels, and Kuat Vehicles focused on in-atmosphere repulsor lift-driven vehicles, and Kuat Systems Engineering focused on starfighter design. KDY used its massive influence and capital also gained control and board positions in important companies like the Trade Federation, Techno Union, and Corporate Sector Authority. This actually gave the company an unprecedented amount of control over the Starship manufacturing industry, and that was because they also had control over a lot of the clients at this point, and of course, KDY would select their own products here. When the second Boeing 737 MAX crashed, killing everyone on board, investigators revealed a company that was hyper-focused on profit and cost-cutting. Boeing, instead of redesigning what essentially was a half-century-old 737 design, continued to push for cheaper incremental changes, which is where all the problems with the 737 MAX started. Further investigations into Boeing revealed that the FAA basically lacked the resources to regulate Boeing's designs, and so they allowed Boeing's engineers to self-regulate, which is really terrifying. Since the 737 MAX accident, Boeing is still going strong and slowly regaining its stock prices, and that's because it's so intertwined with the US government and national security that our federal government would never allow it to fail. Because then the Europeans and their socialist Airbuses would take over, or something like that. For better or worse, situations like Boeing give investors peace of mind that their hard-earned money won't disappear if they invest in a company like this. And while Kuat Drive Yards dominated the planet that they existed on, what they really needed was a lucrative contract with the Republic. But it wasn't really until the Clone Wars when KDY started gaining significant lead over their shipbuilding competitors. This is mainly thanks to Kuat Drive Yards' massive orbital shipyards. While most Star Wars ships under a kilometer long had in-atmosphere capabilities and could be built within a planet's gravity well and then fly out, superclass dreadnoughts and destroyers that could range from 3 kilometers to 20 kilometers could only really be built in an orbital shipyard. And Kuat Drive Yards, as we mentioned before, had the biggest and best facilities in the galaxy. And so they began creating massive ships for their own defense fleet, like the Mandator-class Star Dreadnought. KDY's main competitor at this point, Rendeli's Star Drive, was only capable of creating much smaller ships like the Dreadnought-class cruiser. And so with the outbreak of the Clone Wars, KDY essentially took over all of the Clone Army's contracts. They would be responsible for the Venator-class Star Destroyer, Archidans-class light cruiser, and the Pelta-class frigate. Their subsidiary company, Rothana Heavy Engineering, would produce the Acclimator-class assault ship, along with the LAAT gunship. And that was only the starships that KDY and their subsidiaries would contribute to the war effort. They would also help construct the Republic's walkers, like the ATTE and ATRT. KDY would also be responsible for the HAVW A6 Juggernaut turbo tank. Throughout the war, KDY would also start buying out smaller vendors in their own supply chain. You see, what they really wanted was complete vertical integration so that they can control everything when it came to manufacturing a vehicle or a ship. And that is exactly what Emperor Palpatine wanted as well. His military-first political philosophy depended on the destruction of the free market and also the civilian job market. In its place would be the Imperial military recruitment system and the military-industrial complex. He wanted everyone in the galaxy working towards the stability of the Empire through military means. And so massive companies like KDY, with all of their holdings, were essential for creating a massive military that was also affordable. The story of KDY is the story of a corporation that is so massive that it will most likely become a permanent part of the economic landscape. And while that might be enticing to some investors out there like you, Steve, keep in mind that such monopolies destroy competition, and the long-term impact of this type of company is unknown. We recently did a video talking about Corellian Incom Corporation, one of the most popular and ancient Starship manufacturers in the galaxy. Throughout its existence, CEC has designed thousands of different models and starships. And this design firm definitely has a style that makes their ships extremely recognizable. And they have a very large and loyal fan base who swears by their products. In today's video, what I want to take a look at is the other end of the spectrum, and that's much smaller manufacturers and shipyards that are known for basically just one or two designs. You know, the process of designing, setting up the production and marketing of a vessel is extremely competitive and difficult, even for the larger firms in the Star Wars galaxy. And so it's very unique and special when a smaller manufacturer manages to get their product out there. It doesn't even need to beat the products from the larger companies because, you know, they're kind of running their own race in their own category. Every good Star Wars RPG needs a good ship. And that's because when we travel to the Star Wars galaxy as fans, we always want to see multiple planets and explore. In KOTOR, we have the Ebon Hawk. In The Force Unleashed, there was the Rogue Shadow, and in Jedi Outcast, you had Raven's Claw. These ships serve as far more than just a base for operations and transportation. They are the player's home. And this really does mirror the role ships play in the main Star Wars films and TV shows as well. You have Han and Chewie's Millennium Falcon, the Bad Batch's Marauder, you have Din Djarin's Razor Crest, Ahsoka's T6 Jedi Shuttle, and Luthen Rael's Fondor Hallcraft. Now, as you can tell, all these people we mentioned are a bit eccentric. They're loners, they're adventurers, very independent-minded, and that's perhaps why they spend their time amongst the stars in their own personal ship, rather than settling on one specific planet. I mean, why live in a box in some Duracrete jungle when you can bring that box with you anywhere in the galaxy? People who think like this are definitely a special breed. Individuals like Grease Dritus, the captain of the Stinger Mantis, an ally of Cal Kestis. Like Han Solo, Grease started out as a hustler, looking out only for himself. But then, he found a greater calling.
Before you came along, all I cared about was a tight hand on a stiff heater. That's a game term.
I know what it is.
Grease was a Latteron, a species known for having an additional pair of arms. There are a few species in the galaxy that share this trait, like the Basilisk and Ardenians. These extra limbs, and perhaps equally as important, the brain power and coordination necessary to use them all, made these species excellent pilots. And so it's only natural for Latteran pilots to have a much more advanced custom control scheme that will allow them to kind of maneuver the ship in ways you really couldn't with just two arms. And Grease Dritus's Stinger Mantis is a great example of this type of control scheme. His ship was a S-161XL, a luxury yacht that comes from Latero Spaceworks. Most of you have probably never heard of this shipbuilder, and this is really the only product that we know they built. But judging by its design and how it's functioned in both the Jedi games, seems to be pretty well built. This was a long and beautiful yacht, and it was able to keep Cal and his company safe and comfortable throughout all of their crazy adventures. One of the more unusual features of this ship was the large outrigger engine that rotates around the main body of the ship. It's an expensive and complex design that requires additional maintenance, and generally speaking, you only see these types of designs on a smaller starship like a B-Wing, for instance. I imagine scaling it up to a yacht size is going to be a lot more difficult, and it's going to cost a lot more maintenance. Good thing is Grease is also a mechanic, so he probably knows how to fix everything. And since Latterons have an additional pair of arms, it would make sense to add another controllable surface onto the ship that gives pilots extra option for thrust direction. Overall, Latteron Spaceworks' design here isn't for most species, but one cannot deny its natural beauty and respect Grease's ability to pilot the ship. Before we continue, a quick word from our sponsor for today's video, Ownersaber.com. They make these very awesome premium lightsabers. And now that November is here, they'll be rolling out their Black Friday monthly special. Buy any replica category lightsaber and you can get a free Padawan lightsaber for free. Simply add both of these blades to your shopping cart and their system will automatically make the Padawan blade free. This offer runs from November 1st to November 30th. I personally have my eyes on the Malgus. Yes, you guys remember that brute of a Sith Lord from the Old Republic era? His lightsaber hilt has two blade-shaped guards, which kind of makes the weapon look like an entrenching tool of some kind. Makes it useful even when the emitter is broken in combat. And you can pair that with the much less serious Padawan saber known as the Last Brick. Giant Lego hand claws are not included. For more information about this deal, check out our description down below. Thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. The The planet Naboo is quite small from a population standpoint, especially if you sweep the Gungans back into their swamps and only count the humans. But for security and perhaps cultural reasons, the Naboo monarchy decided to set up their own starship design and manufacturing based out of the palace complex on Theed. Known as the Theed Palace Space Vessel Engineering Corps, this wasn't really a company, it was more like a private manufacturer that worked only for the monarchy. This wasn't about making profits or any kind of groundbreaking ships. It was about serving the needs of the Naboo. And the Naboo were idealistic individuals, and they wanted their warships to reflect the cultural values of the planet. They wanted aesthetically beautiful ships to represent the monarchy, and they wanted these ships to utilize environmentally friendly technologies. Theed Palace Engineering would keep these requirements in mind while designing the N-1 starfighter for the Naboo Royal Space Fighter Corps. The N-1 was a truly special ship, and what made it so special starts out with the fuel it used. You see, the entire crisis on Naboo that started years before the Clone Wars began revolved around the Trade Federation's presence on the planet. They had been invited by the previous administration to help set up mining and transport facilities for the large plasma deposits found beneath the surface of the planet. This plasma was a unique energy source because it was so pure in nature that when it was used to power engines, it gave off far less emissions. Theed Palace would make sure that the N-1 would utilize this energy source. On top of that, they made the N-1 extremely sleek and small, which made it nimble and agile, and perfect for its more defensive roles and interception missions. The N-1 did have some weaknesses though. It wasn't particularly good in the ground attack mission, but I guess that's okay because again, this was mainly for a planetary defense force. Overall, the N-1 starfighter was extremely expensive to produce, not only because the Naboo only ordered a small batch of them, but because of the cutting-edge technology like an advanced autopilot and premium parts like the G-type Nubian 221 Sunlight engines. You know, as much money as the Naboo had, they probably didn't have enough money to design their own components like, engines and hyperdrives. They had to still buy these off the shelf, and they really did like Nubian designs, and so a lot of their ships had components from the Nubians. Theed Palace Space Vessel Engineering Corps would also be responsible for building several yachts and cruisers for their monarch's visit to other systems and other planets. These were all one-off designs and were basically a work of art. They also used Nubian components, and they were also usually covered in chromium. The X-Wing is perhaps one of the most famous starfighters in the entire galaxy. It was the snub fighter that helped the rebellion win the war. It took down both Death Stars, hundreds of Star Destroyers, and countless Imperial TIE fighters. The X-Wing is really the ship that made Incom Corporation the household name that would become during the New Republic period. The X-Wing can trace its lineage back through the Clone Wars with the ARC 170 design all the way back to the pre-Clone Wars era with the Z95 Headhunter, Incom Corporation's first true starfighter. In many ways, Incom took a look at these two older designs and took all of their strengths and none of their weaknesses and brought them over to the X-Wing. What most people don't realize is prior to the Z95, Incom was mainly known for just producing repulsor lifts, including the massive ones that kept Cloud City floating over the gas giant Bespin. And so the Z95 was actually a huge leap for Incom Corporation. They really had no knowledge on how to build a starfighter, and so instead of building a starfighter from the ground up, they instead brought a prototype from a company known as Bahalian Shipyard. Originally known as the Onyx Star prototype, the Z95 was a perfectly balanced starfighter. It was nimble, easy to fly, and quite fast. It was also relatively cheap and efficient as well when it came to performance. We just talked about the repulsor lifts that kept Cloud City up. But did you know that Bespin also had their own small vehicle manufacturing firm? You see, Bespin was a gas giant, and Cloud City was mainly built for its employees who worked in the Tibanna gas mining industry. But the city would grow over the years to a population of 6 million due to Lando Calrissian's great management skills. And mining Tibanna gas was a very profitable industry with very large margins, especially when there were galactic wars or just not enough commodities to be traded. And as Bespin became richer, it only makes sense that they would have their own vehicle company. Also, Lando Calrissian, the administrator of the city, was always known for his business acumen and interest in exploring new industries. Now, Bespin Motors was first established to basically support the mining operations on the gas giant below the city. And this meant that they usually produce repulsor sleds for moving equipment and raw materials around. But they would also try their hands in creating a smaller speeder known as the Storm 4 Twin Pod. This strange little patrol craft was utilized by the Bespin Wind Guard to keep law and order. The craft featured two pods connected by a central strut that also housed the engines. The ion engine utilized here is not all that different from the TIE Fighter's engine, and the Cloud car also had a light blaster cannon. The Cloud car is often ridiculed by people who see it, but in my opinion, it does the job that's required of it. Also, when you're such a small company like MandalMotors, you just have limited resources. You can't spend a lot of money on research and design. During the aftermath of the assassination attempt of Senator Padme Amidala, the young senator was sent back to her homeworld in Naboo with her Jedi guardian Anakin Skywalker. The two decided to take public transportation in order to keep their departure hidden, and they essentially booked a flight on the Star Wars equivalent of Frontier Airlines. I mean, everyone always gives Spirit Airlines a lot of crap, but we shouldn't leave out Frontier. If anything, they're kind of worse than Spirit, right? Anyway, this here is an AA-9 freighter liner, a 390-meter long box with a Class 4 hyperdrive. It can and probably should be only hauling tons of supplies, but you could also fit 30,000 passengers in there. It's cheap and it gets the job done. And it's built by a relatively unknown company known as Jeff Shipyards. The AA-9 freighter liner would actually propel the company into the limelight as the AA-9 would become popular during the Clone Wars. It would transport not only civilian freight and passengers, but also war material and troops for the Galactic Republic. After this initial success, Jeff would use the new capital to design and build a military vessel known as the SS-54 assault ship. Although Jeff Shipyards was probably too small to compete for larger federal contracts, plenty of independent buyers lined up for this gunship, which was competitively priced and featured a Class 2 hyperdrive. Most of the buyers were either mercenaries or bounty hunters, but that doesn't really matter, does it? Jeff would also design and build the Mako Ta space docks. It was originally a shipyard that would be used by the rebellion to gather their fleet. If I asked you which ship served not only the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War, but also the Resistance versus First Order War, well, there's only really a handful. You could probably say the Z95 Headhunter that we mentioned before, but a far better answer would be the BTL Y-Wing series from Koensayr Manufacturing. Koensayr Manufacturing dabbled in all sorts of different areas in the shipbuilding industry. It designed protection like flight helmets. It also made important components like ion engines and hyperdrives. When the Clone Wars started, Koensayr saw an opportunity. The galaxy had been demilitarized for almost 1,000 years, and so a lot of the infrastructure, the military-industrial complex, had basically just faded away or rotted away, if anything. And so now, whoever could get these large federal contracts that the Republic was giving out due to the Clone Wars could potentially secure their future as a shipbuilder. Koensayr Manufacturing strategically designed the BTLB Y-Wing. It would help balance out the Galactic Republic Starfighter Corps, which early on in the war was mainly made up of the V-19 Torrent fighter and the Jedi's Nimble Delta 7 Ether Sprite. I mean, both ships were interceptors, and they were very light interceptors. They hardly had any protection on them, and they didn't really have heavy munitions either. The Y-Wing, which was an assault bomber, could do both of those things very well. So well that the Y-Wing would continue to live on during the Imperial era. Despite the Empire's attempt to scrap the vessel, Rebel forces were still able to steal or buy as many of these old Clone Wars ships as they could get their hands on. And they also refit them for combat. This variant would even get its own designation, the BTLA-4 Y-Wing. This variant had its engine cowls removed, which decreased the length of the ship and also the weight, and it gave mechanics easier access to the engines for maintenance. And this was without Koensayr's help, really. I mean, this was just something they did on the run here. And Koensayr Manufacturing really struggled when the Empire came into power, since most of their starships didn't rely on hyperdrives. Suddenly, Koensayr Manufacturing's parts business started doing really bad. After the Galactic Civil War ended, the popularity of the Y-Wing gave Koensayr an opportunity to reboot the Y-Wing. This time, they basically copied all the fixes the Rebel engineers made and produced the BTA-NR-2 Y-Wing. So we started off today's video talking about Corellian Engineering Corporation, and I want to end this video talking about them as well. You see, in true Corellian fashion, CEC actually had a lot of competition from smaller manufacturers on its own planet, including a company known as Corelli Space. They were a much smaller outfit, and they had a much simpler and easier to reach goal, and that was to challenge CEC's dominance in just one category, and that is the smaller freighter market. Specifically, Corelli Space wanted to take on the YT series. Their response was this, the Jim Snore Light Freighter. Overall, there were 3 variants of this ship, and there were many design flaws that made this ship actually inferior to the YT series. And so, generally speaking, it was very common to see these ships outside of the Corellian system.
People like to say that investing in the Starship manufacturing industry is risky. And yes, this is a volatile industry. There are cycles. Politics, galaxy-wide wars can make or break an entire company. And plus, people get emotional about their favorite ships, which is a problem. But with the right research, discipline, and mindset, you can make a killing. I mean, you work hard for your money, Steve, and you probably realize now that your wife was right all along, that betting your child's college funds on underground Ewok fights is not an investment. It's actually called a gambling addiction. So why not subscribe to our channel where we give you guys in-depth looks at all of the major corporations in the Star Wars galaxy, so you can decide for yourself whether it's a good choice to buy or not. Anyway, in our last video, we talked about the struggles that older companies like Sant and Sienar faced. You know, bureaucratic bloat, corporate nepotism, just a lack of innovation. Well, a lot of older companies face this kind of problems, and the company we're going to talk about today has also been around almost nearly as long as Sienar has. But instead of being controlled by one single family, this company has exchanged hands more often than the Darksaber has over the course of history. But before we talk about what company that is, if you guys spend a lot of time on the phone, you know it's pretty hard to find a game that can keep you entertained. That's why I'm excited to introduce you to our sponsor, Astra, a rewards app for Android that helps you discover new games, complete tasks with them, and earn coins which can be traded in for gift cards with PayPal, Google Play, Amazon, and more. It's truly a win-win situation. Make your screen time more productive and earn some extra cash for beer, coffee, death sticks. Astra is only available for Android devices. Once you download it from the Google Play Store, you can browse through their robust library of video games ranging from hyper-casual to mid-core levels of commitment. Astra also has a tracking system to show you what games you're playing and what your high scores are. You can also invite your friends to play and get a bonus when they complete their first task. New users of Astra will receive 200 free coins plus a welcome coupon. Additionally, you'll double the rewards for the first game you play. But this offer is only available within the first 24 hours of you registering. Also, make sure to log into the app every day to receive daily rewards and weekly bonuses in coins which you can trade for gift cards. So what are you waiting for? Download Astra today and discover your next favorite game and start earning rewards for playing. Anyway, the company we'll be talking about today is Hoersch Kessel Drive Incorporated. It was a company founded by Neimoidians who honestly get a bad rep in Star Wars because of individuals like Lot Dodd and Newt Gunray, who aren't any more representatives of their species than Logan Paul is, a representation of human beings. Neimoidians are actually a species that evolved from the Duros. You can kind of see the similarities in their eyes and lack of a nose. Neimoidia started out as a Duros colony many thousands of years ago, but humid weather and heavy gravity slowly changed them until they were physically different enough to be a different species. The Neimoidians lived a very tough and terrible existence for much of their early history. You'll find that a lot of the more aggressive and expansionary species in the Star Wars galaxy, like the Hutts, the Mandalorians, people from Staten Island who go down to the Jersey Shore every summer, all share that very similar background. Now, people tend to perceive Neimoidians as greedy and cowardly, but after reading the Brotherhood novel where Anakin and Obi-Wan Kenobi go to investigate a bombing on one of their purse worlds, Cato Neimoidia, I kind of understood their species better. Empathy is hell of a superpower once you tap into it properly. See, the Neimoidians are meticulous and cautious because of their life experience. A Neimoidian starts out life as a grub in kind of a hive situation, and for the first 7 years of their life they have to fight for resources, food, and space in order to survive. If they don't get enough nutrition, they actually turn into a mindless grub, or a mindless drone, so it's actually kind of terrifying. Environments like this tend to create cultural trauma that have most Neimoidians, always planning ahead and saving resources even when they don't need to. And thus, for survival reasons, the Neimoidians have always been super rational and calculating in their decision-making process, which makes them especially well-suited for the business world, especially in low-margin businesses like logistics, where attention to detail and good planning is extremely important. Now, in the earlier years of the Neimoidians' expansion to other worlds, Hoersch Kessel Drive Incorporated, or HKD, which we'll call them for the rest of the video, really started growing alongside that expansionary effort. By 4000 BBY, HKD was one of the most successful shipbuilding companies in the Old Republic. They developed the Delia-class Courier, a large 70-meter-long ship that had the speed and maneuverability of a starfighter, but plenty of habitable space inside and storage for trade. The entire ship was also heavily automated, so you technically only needed one crew member on board, which was impressive. You see, Neimoidians, as a species, heavily preferred to use droids to do
do any type of manual labor work or just hazardous work. This, of course, is due to their more cautious nature, which we talked about. Risk assessment was actually not just something the Neimoidians did, it was an important part of their culture, something they took great pride in. You know, it took a lot for a Neimoidian to survive until adulthood. And so they were also pretty obsessed with status and liked to surround themselves with battle droids and droid servants to make themselves feel more secure and look more important. And so the Neimoidians put a lot of effort into minimalizing the crews on their starships and using droids and computer systems to manage the various systems on board. Most HKD incorporated ships were built like this. The unintended side effect is that it made their ships much cheaper to operate, and that, along with Neimoidia's position on the major Corellian trade route, meant that the Neimoidians as a species naturally gravitated towards logistics and trade as well. The Trade Federation would be partially founded by Neimoidians. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, Alan, this video is about the worst ship manufacturer in the galaxy, so what's up? You haven't said anything bad about HKD yet. Well, what basically happened to most ship manufacturing companies was the Rusan Reformation. 1,000 years of peace is terrible if a large part of your portfolio includes building, military ships. And HKD was affected by this 1,000 year of peace as well. And when you destroy an industry leader like this, you also destroy technology and the know-how to create certain things. By the time of the late Republic era, HKD was a shadow of what it once had been, and now it mainly built super transports and container vessels, usually numbering less than 100 a year. Such vessels were relatively expensive to build and also purchase, but they were always in demand, especially with the Republic and Jedi's new focus on establishing more trade routes and stability in the Outer Rim region. This naturally created more opportunities for resource extraction and manufacturing in the region, which needed new super freighters to service them. Plus, HKD's computer and droid integration into their platforms was still second to none, and super container ships really needed minimal crews in order to run a profit. Now, the organization we talked about before, the Trade Federation, would grow in power during this period of time. The Trade Federation actually started out as a commerce guild, which was designed to basically mediate trade disputes and disputes between shipping companies and merchants. The Trade Federation was also a trade union that fought against the large corpos like Pulsar Supertank, Quasar Cargo, Red Star, which not only had scale in their favor, they also controlled many of the Outer Rim spaceports in the galaxy and either charged exorbitant fees or just straight up denied competitors access. These companies also refused to share navigational data with other companies, which was kind of a taboo thing. I mean, most spacers shared navigational data for safety reasons, right? There's a lot of debris out in space that can destroy or hit your ship. And so the Trade Federation essentially organized a lot of smaller and mid-sized shipping companies together. They established standard policies and regulations, and they tried to challenge these much larger shipping companies. And one of the things that the Trade Federation did was contracting HKD to build a pretty large fleet of their LH-3210 cargo freighters. This significantly increased the company's revenue and production scale. They're also Neimoidian members of the Trade Federation's directorate board, and they most likely had relationships with the executives in HKD, a Neimoidian-run company. Now, this massive purchase of cargo freighters would allow the Trade Federation's aligned shipping companies to quickly grow in size. Not only did they increase the amount of goods that these smaller transportation companies could haul, these larger ships also deterred piracy, one of the bigger issues plaguing companies of all sizes. Soon, the Trade Federation started rivaling the core-based shipping companies in both revenue and operation scale, and,
you either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
A few things would occur that would also greatly increase the power of the Trade Federation. First, the Nile conflict would lead to the destruction of the Starlight Beacon and essentially stop the federal government's attempt to civilize and establish order in the Outer Rim. As the Republic started focusing corewards once again in the last few centuries of its rule, the Galactic Senate, in a last-ditch effort to alleviate the great poverty and instability in the region, created the Free Trade Zone. This essentially lifted all taxes and regulations from the Outer Rim territories, and this was designed to attract commerce and capital investment to the region. Organizations like the Trade Federation and other mega conglomerates were quick to jump on this opportunity, moving their operations out of the colonies and mid-territories to this new tax haven. With almost zero Republic presence in these areas with no regulatory bodies, companies could operate in a much more efficient and cruel way in these areas, and they started basically flooding the core
of the galaxy with cheap resources and cheap products, which only increased the power that these mega conglomerates had over the political system. Their attempts to reform the free trade zone in 67 BBY, but by that time, the Senate's ability to affect this part of the galaxy had greatly diminished. In exchange for allowing new regulation that would make it easier for startups to begin operating in the Outer Rim, the Trade Federation was granted a seat in the Senate, putting them on the same level as many member worlds. Which is kind of crazy. I mean, a lot of these member worlds were represented by like a sector level representative, which means one representative for maybe hundreds, if not thousands, of worlds. Yet the Trade Federation got direct representation. This was corruption at its height. At the same time, the Trade Federation was also lobbying for more defensive measures to be placed on their starships, which went directly against the Rusan Reformation's Demilitarization Act. The Trade Federation ships were being attacked more frequently by bandits and now ideologically driven pirates like the Stark Commercial Combine, who created an almost Robin Hood-like image of themselves, robbing the rich, powerful corpos and spreading the wealth to the downtrodden of the Outer Rim. In truth, both sides in this scuffle were kind of villainous in their own way. To solve their needs, the Trade Federation started arming their ships with weapons, something that HKD was contracted to do in complete secrecy. At this point, the Trade Federation secretly purchased HKD through their own subsidiaries, most likely set up by Damask Holdings. This was a Sith-backed lobbying and financial group that sought to create disruption in the Outer Rim to keep the Republic and the Jedi Guardian off balance. By 32 BBY, outcry against these corpo-feudal states in the Outer Rim reached a new height, and the Senate was finally forced to pass Prop 31814D, which brought taxation back to this region. This would affect most corporations operating in the Outer Rim, but none would be more affected than the Trade Federation, which would report huge losses as a result. In an act of protest, they would blockade the entire planet of Naboo, hoping that their own proposed bill in Senate would pass as a result. This is clearly an unwise move to blackmail the Senate and also carry out an unprovoked attack against a member state, but the Sith that set the situation up perfectly. Due to the Trade Federation's power and allies in the Senate, and the Republic's lack of political will to punish them, along with no federal military that could actually intervene, the Naboo blockade dragged on longer than it should have, which ultimately led to Queen Amidala of Naboo calling for a vote of no confidence in the Galactic Senate. With sympathy for Naboo and their plight at an all-time high, the Senator of Naboo was quickly voted into the Chancellor's office. He also happened to be a Sith Lord who orchestrated this entire crisis like a true political maestro. But like a true Sith, Palpatine would abandon the Trade Federation, and soon after, Viceroy Nu Gunray would be put on trial. It would also become very clear that HKD freighters, those same LH-3219 cargo freighters we talked about before, have been retrofitted into battleships with shield generators, weapon emplacements. The massive cargo area in these 3,000 meter diameter vessels had also been turned into staging grounds for battle droids, tanks, troop carriers, and starfighters. HKD was clearly responsible for these upgrades, and people were shocked by the extent that the Trade Federation had militarized. But sadly, this was just a taste of things to come, a testing ground for weapons that would tear the galaxy apart in the future Clone Wars. The Neimoidians were forced to sell HKD as the company was also sanctioned for subverting centuries-old laws on demilitarization. Eventually, a group of Duros investors would purchase HKD. As we mentioned before, the Neimoidians and Duros were quite close, and they maintained a lot of contact, and the Duros investors tried to at least maintain the same culture within the company for a while. But eventually they had to sell the company to a Nibinese clan who had been eyeing the company for many centuries. The Nibinese were an interesting species. They were known for their love of puzzle solving, information gathering, and believe it or not, bureaucracy. When the Nibinese joined the Republic, they found the convoluted bureaucratic system that ran the galaxy was quite simple when compared to their own extremely complex bureaucratic system. And so they became experts at navigating the Republic's laws and regulation. And HKD at this point had become a puzzle that no one really wanted to tackle. I mean, they were no longer profitable. They had very ancient technology that needed upgrading. They needed a lot of investment in R&D. And their association with the Naboo blockade made them toxic from the point of view of most within the financial community. The Nibinese were able to buy HKD on the cheap, and they immediately started trimming the fat, which makes a lot of sense. You know, they got rid of the departments that weren't really making money, but then they started looking at other cost-cutting measures. They started lowering benefits for their workers. They started squeezing their vendors, and this led to a destruction of the morale in the company, and a lot of the lead designers in HKD would leave. The beginning of the Clone Wars, however, created opportunities for everyone in the shipbuilding industry. While most reputable companies like Incom, Kuat Systems Engineering, and Slayn Korpil competed for Republic contracts, HKD, already in the Republic's political doghouse, so to speak, found new customers in the enemies of the Republic, the Separatist Alliance. The Trade Federation's new gunray, along with many leading members of the Outer Rim mega conglomerates, made up the council for the governing body of the Separatist movement, and they were already HKD customers from the past. And so it made a lot of sense that HKD would become one of the main ship suppliers for the Confederate Navy. Not that either side really had a choice in the matter, it was just a necessary business cooperation. Now you'll notice the three ships we talk about in this next section all started life as freighters. They're basically just commercial ships with bolted on things to make them into warships. The reason why HKD never redesigned any of their ships to become true warships is probably because of the cost saving measures introduced by the Nimbinese. And so this is really just one of the worst periods in the company's history. A lot of these ships would underperform compared to other ships in their class. The LH-3210 capital ship that had been covertly modified to become battleships in the years leading up to the Clone Wars were now being openly manufactured as battleships. At the center of this platform were the core ships. After the Galactic Republic forced the Trade Federation to disarm their original battleships, the Trade Federation secretly kept the core ships, which resembled the shape of a Neimoidian hive and would serve as the basis for the new fleet of Lucrehulk battleships. The core ships housed massive generators and operation centers for the larger vessel. Their biggest advantage was really their massive size. That gave them a huge amount of cargo capacity. During the Battle of Geonosis, for instance, millions of battle droids and war material managed to escape the conflict aboard these Lucrehulks. A single one could carry up to 6,520 AAT hover tanks, 139,000 B-1 battle droids, and 1,500 Vulture-class starfighters, all of which could be controlled from the Center Sphere's command center. Now, despite their size, the Lucrehulk battleships really were kind of underpowered and didn't perform nearly as well as other ships of their size. The shape of the vessel was designed for hauling cargo, and that meant there was plenty of surface area on the ship that needed to be covered in armored plating and gun emplacements. Clone pilots quickly developed an understanding of where the blind spots in the ship's overlapping point defense weapons firing arcs were. For the same reason why cargo ships in our own world would make poor naval vessels, the Lucrehulk's commercial design origin made it far too big of a target to hit, and it really didn't have enough defensive capabilities to protect it. The vessel would ultimately have to rely on massive swarms of droid fighters to defend itself properly. Another one of HKD's products was the Munificent-class star frigate, which was originally designed for the IGBC for hauling valuables and patrolling its territory. These ships had a skeletal look because there were actually very minimal pressurized compartments on this ship. This ship had a very small crew and was mostly powered by droids and computers. Also, most of the cargo containers could be docked externally, although there was a large area in the front of the ship where you could store things internally. The Munificent-class star frigate also didn't have a hangar, so fighters were docked externally as well. The structural integrity of this vessel was quite questionable. Instead of having a solid superstructure, a series of tensor fields and inertial compensators helped the ship maintain its rigidity, which instantly became a problem once the power generators took a hit, and they often did in the middle of a battle. Like the Lucrehulk, the Munificent class also had weapons bolted onto its surface and relied heavily on droid fighters for cover. The ship could carry an impressive 150,000 B-1 battle droids. This was by far one of the most numerous vessels that HKD produced, with over 10,000 units delivered to the CIS Navy. Lastly, we have the Recusant class destroyer, which was created for the Commerce Guild. This is another relatively skeletal design thanks to HKD's preference for automated ships. Although the droid brain that actually navigated for this ship was quite antiquated, and so the Recusant class had a tendency to crash into other vessels while in fleet formation, which is obviously not something you want. The Recusant class could carry around 40,000 battle droids internally, but an upsized carrier variant was also designed. It should be noted that all three of these HKD vessels benefited from having extremely robust shields that allowed them to survive engagements for much longer periods of time. But because none of these ships were purpose-built warships and their structures were pretty weak, once the shields failed, these ships could be easily destroyed by concentrated turbo laser fire. Ultimately, the Confederacy was desperate to work with HKD and vice versa. This was a sad end to a truly ancient company. Now, several HKD ships would be refitted by the Rebel Alliance during the Galactic Civil War, but as far as we know, this would be the last we would hear from this venerable company.
Today I want to talk to you guys about one of the greatest rivalries in Star Wars history. And no, I'm not talking about the Jedi and Sith or even the Empire versus the Rebellion. I'm talking about the epic battle for Starship manufacturing supremacy fought between two great companies, Incom Corporation and Sienar Fleet Systems. Now, this was not only a rivalry born out of market competition like Pepsi versus Coca-Cola, or the clashing of large egos of great men like Ford versus Ferrari. There was no 24 hours at Le Mans in this competition. This battle instead represented a much larger conflict for the soul of an entire galaxy being fought between the Rebel Alliance and the Galactic Empire. This competition between starfighter manufacturers pitted two competing ideologies in both design and style against each other in the purest and rawest test of supremacy, the dogfight. First, we have the famed Incom Corporation. Born out of humble beginnings, Incom was originally known as Torianix Inertial Compensator Corporation. The inertial compensator was a boring but extremely important piece of technology that made even the most basic maneuvers in a starfighter possible. This device used anti-gravity technology to extend a bubble around the ship to protect it from massive acceleration and maneuvers that one might do in a starfighter. It also prevented the pilots inside from blacking out or just getting crushed into goo during even the most basic maneuvers. The average human in a flight suit can withstand 9 Gs before passing out. Taking those numbers into consideration, something as slow and massive like the Executor-class Star Dreadnought was still capable of accelerating with a force of 1,000 Gs. There is no flight suit or armor in the universe that could protect you from that kind of force. So inertial compensators are among the most important components that you can find within a starfighter. They needed to be durable and also very reliable. Mastering the technology behind an inertial compensator meant that Torianix was ready to move on to other products that also depended on anti-gravity generation. So Torianix Inertial Compensator Corporation, that's a mouthful, rebranded itself as Incom Corporation and started focusing on building repulsor lifts. Repulsor lifts were one of the most common engine types in the galaxy. They used anti-gravity technology to levitate objects. As long as this engine was close to a large mass or a planet, these lifts could lift a massive amount of weight with very little effort and energy. Most in-atmospheric crafts used repulsors, so it was a massive market, but Incom quickly found out that it was also a very crowded and competitive industry. So they decided to focus on a very demanding niche market and started producing high-performance repulsor lifts used only for large stations. These repulsor lifts not only had to be extremely powerful, they also had to be very reliable because they were oftentimes holding up entire cities. Around 400 BBY, Incom landed a very high-profile project when they were hired to design the repulsor lifts that would keep Bespin Cloud City in the upper atmosphere. Now that Incom was building these amazing repulsor lifts for giant stations, the next logical step for them was to step down and start building repulsors for civilian and military application. And so in the next few hundred years leading up to the Clone Wars, Incom began establishing itself as one of the premier starfighter designers in the galaxy. Now the Republic had been at peace for almost a millennia. This is why the Galactic Republic had no federal navy and instead relied on a peacekeeping force known as the Judicials. This of course didn't mean that there wasn't unrest and small regional conflicts, especially in the lawless Outer Rim regions. Most planets in those areas had to rely on their own government to create a local or planetary defense force. Maintaining a fleet of capital ships was only a luxury that some of the largest and richest planets could afford to do in the Inner Rim, and so most of these Outer Rim planets relied on starfighters to protect their sovereignty. Incom would begin a joint starfighter project with Subpro Corporations. Subpro Corporation was a Trandoshan outfit, which meant they brought along with them a wide range of negative stereotypes. But strangely enough, Subpro Corporation was full of extremely competent engineers, and despite being considered a second-tier manufacturer, designed excellent quality ships at a bargain price. Incom combined their own very reliable engine technology with Subpro's knowledge and experience in building airframes, and this led to the Z-95 Headhunter. The Z-95 was a thing of beauty. It had extremely simple lines, but at the same time was extremely aggressive looking and intimidating. It's exactly what you would imagine a starfighter should look like. Incom always had this uncanny ability of designing ships that just looked perfect. And everything they built after the Z-95 was modeled after it aesthetically, featuring large rocket-like thrusters and a long beak nose in the front to house sensors.
The Z-95 started out as a very versatile but short-range fighter. It featured 4 of Incom's 2A fission engines that were arranged around the cockpit. This would be a very popular Incom-style design for future vessels. It was equipped with a decent shield generator mounted directly behind the cockpit, and it was armed with ion cannons, wingtip laser cannons, and a pair of Krupp's MG5 concussion missile launchers. By the time the Clone Wars had started, the Z-95 platform was already considered outdated by most industry experts. A lot of people didn't like the extended wings on the Z-95, for instance. They created drag, which used to be essential for atmospheric vehicles, but after the invention of the repulsor lifts, starfighters didn't really need to be aerodynamically designed anymore. This needlessly increased the profile of the Z-95 and made it a lot larger than competing droid fighters usually used by corporations. The ship also wasn't hyperspace ring compatible, which meant that it heavily depended on carriers for hyperspace transportation. Despite all this, with the breakout of the Clone Wars, the Z-95 was placed on a short list of starfighters for the Republic to acquire because of its durability and flight characteristics. But ultimately, what limited the deployment of the Z-95 when compared to ships like the V-19 Torrent starfighter was its size. The Republic Navy was built around the Venator-class Star Destroyer, a capital ship with a uniquely designed starfighter hangar that ran down almost the entirety of its body. The Venator class heavily depended on its starfighters to protect it from enemy ships, and the V-19 Torrent, with its folding wings, was far more compact than the much larger Z-95. The Republic still ordered a special clone variant of the Z-95, which replaced the 4 2A Incom fission engines with 2 larger engines. Also, instead of just carrying concussion missiles, the Z-95 clone version now carried proton torpedoes, significantly increasing its anti-capital ship abilities. With the breakout of the war, Incom and Subpro also started specifically designing a new starfighter for the Republic. This was known as the Aggressive Reconnaissance 170, otherwise known as the ARC 170. Now, while the term aggressive reconnaissance seems like an oxymoron or a self-defeating design, it actually perfectly fit what the Republic needed in the earlier days of the war. Lacking a true naval force with an adequate amount of capital ships, the GAR was limited to using starfighters, assault transports, and judicial corvettes in the early battles of the Clone Wars. Not only were they completely outgunned by the Separatist Navy, they were also completely outnumbered. During these confusing first days of the Clone Wars, dozens of planets were falling to the Confederacy each day, and the GAR lacked the resources to confirm which systems had fallen, let alone gather enough ships to retake them. The idea behind an aggressive reconnaissance platform was to design a ship that could be self-sufficient for quite a long period of time and, more importantly, travel through hyperspace independently. The resulting ARC 170 was a heavy-duty starfighter. It featured a 3-man crew, a pilot gunner, and a co-pilot for longer missions, along with an astromech. The gunner would man a rear turret armed with a double laser cannon. The ship also featured a proton torpedo launcher, along with 2 wingtip medium laser cannons, which meant that it could do a massive amount of damage against larger shielded ships. It's also one of the first Republic ships to feature a hyperdrive, and it was rated at an impressive Class 1.5. The ARC 170 was terrific at its main job, which usually meant jumping into potentially dangerous systems, scouting them out, and then trying to survive the journey back home. But it actually fared poorly in your standard chaotic dogfight, which were actually quite common during the Clone Wars. The ARC 170 was just too over-designed and engineered, which meant that it was way too slow and heavy when compared to the much smaller and lighter droid fighters being fielded by the Confederacy. And while the ARC 170's massive wingtip laser cannons could take out any snub fighter with one shot, it cycled way too slowly to allow it to be effective in a dogfight. During the Battle of Coruscant, the ARC 170 suffered massive casualties compared to the much smaller and cheaper single-seat fighters being deployed by the GAR. The lessons learned from the Battle of Coruscant would completely shake up Republic starfighter doctrine. For the rest of the war, the Republic Navy would focus its resources on purchasing smaller single-pilot fighters rather than the larger ARC 170s. During the Clone Wars, Republic Sienar Systems was one of the premier manufacturers of dropships and transport vessels, and also produced engines along with small arms. The company was founded by a Sienar family thousands of years before the Clone Wars, and like many family-run legacy companies, it was inflexible and weighed down by tradition. As a result, Republic Sienar Systems was one of many corporations that failed towards the end of the Clone Wars and was purchased at a very cheap price by the intergalactic banking clan, which itself had fallen under the control and influence of Supreme Chancellor Palpatine. This was no coincidence, of course, and all a part of Palpatine's plan to seize control of the galaxy's military-industrial complex in preparation for creating his new Imperial military. Republic Sienar Systems would eventually be restructured into Sienar Fleet Systems, and Rafe Sienar, the Sienar family, would eventually take over all operations. Rafe Sienar happened to be a very close friend to Wilhuff Tarkin and also Chancellor Palpatine. Rafe was a no-nonsense ship designer and engineer who focused on the production side of the business rather than marketing and branding. Building on lessons learned during the Clone Wars, Rafe Sienar was tasked with building a versatile fighter that could replace the dozens of different fighters being utilized by the Republic during the war. During the Clone Wars, Sienar had personally focused on designing luxury yachts and prototype military ships for wealthy clients. He would take inspiration from one of those ships known as the Scimitar, a stealth yacht he had built for Darth Maul, which featured 2 large vertical wings. This would eventually evolve into the prototype for the TIE Fighter line. What made the TIE Fighter so special was its ion engine. At the time, it was considered one of the most precisely manufactured propulsion systems in the galaxy. It had almost no moving parts and required very little maintenance. The TIE Fighter also lacked shields, a hyperdrive, and life support system along with heavier weapons, but this was all a part of Palpatine's grand strategy. At the time, there were 2 main prevailing schools of thought when it came to starfighter doctrine. The first strategy involved designing your fleet around capital ships and carriers. The idea was to put all of your research and funds on fielding the best ships of the line that you could possibly make, meaning the latest shields, weapons, systems, and maximum armor and size. In this school of thought, starfighters were seen almost as an auxiliary force, one of the many weapons on board of a battleship. Starfighters were usually reserved for short-range interception and patrolling. This, of course, was the route the Empire was going to take. The Tarkin Doctrine further made it necessary to inspire fear in the masses in order to assure stability, something that a massive ship did far better than a starfighter ever would. On top of that, the simplicity of the TIE Fighter made it much harder for the Imperial pilots to defect and escape their posts. The second starfighter strategy involved designing your fleet around more complex and capable starfighters that are able to carry out a wide range of combat missions without any support from larger ships. Capital ships in this fleet are not designed for short-range exchanges of fire with other ships. Instead, they rely on good intel and early detection so that they can preemptively launch their starfighters to screen them from other enemy capital ships. Incom throughout the Clone Wars seemed to heavily invest in this second strategy despite losing a considerable amount of their market share after the Battle of Coruscant. Like Republic Sienar Systems, it would encounter financial problems with the end of the Clone Wars and would eventually be nationalized by the Galactic Empire around 1 BBY. By that time, Incom had developed a very independently minded work culture, and a large percentage of the design and engineering staff defected secretly to aid the growing Rebel alliance. The Empire tried their best to round up all of these former Incom staff members, but they were too late to stop them from donating the prototype T-65 X-Wing platform to the Rebellion. The T-65 X-Wing was a balance between the Z-95's overly simple design and the ARC-170's overly complicated design. This single-seated fighter was well protected with shielding and armor, and also equipped with a hyperdrive, but light and nimble enough to dogfight against the much smaller TIE Fighter. A focus on protecting the pilot was important for the fledgling Rebellion, which hardly had enough pilots to keep full fighter wings in operation. The T-65 was also quite simple to fly, and its control surfaces were partly modeled after their civilian atmospheric vehicle, the T-16 Skyhopper. This was actually a common ship for rural pilots in the outer rim of the galaxy, which also happened to be one of the primary recruiting areas for the Rebel Alliance in the earlier days of the war. The T-65 also retained the ARC-170's ability to quickly jump into hostile systems, deliver a payload of weapons, and then escape to safety. This would be one of the primary attack styles for the Rebellion until after their victory at Endor. All other fighters in the Rebel arsenal were also capable of a similar fleet, as the Rebel Alliance lacked larger carriers and capital ships. Head-to-head, the Incom T-65 X-Wing dominated the field against the Sienar TIE Fighter line. Although Imperial pilots were usually better trained and better supported, the lack of shielding on the TIE Fighter proved to be a huge problem. The X-Wing would play a key part in many early Rebel victories, and the Empire was way too slow to react to the disadvantages that the TIE Fighter had against the X-Wing. Sienar would eventually release the TIE Interceptor in an attempt to even the playing field, but it wasn't until Grand Admiral Thrawn personally designed the TIE Defender that the Empire truly had an answer to the X-Wing. But the TIE Fighter program was ultimately too expensive and competed against the Death Star for funding. The Empire ended up never building enough Defenders to turn the tide of the war. So that's the story of Incom versus Sienar, and it's one of the background stories that you might not have heard of, but it's actually quite important to the outcome of the overall galactic civil war. It's also interesting how much these companies kind of reflected the ideologies of the governments or factions they were representing. Well, if you guys have gotten to this point, you've finished the video, and I am really humbled by your ability to listen to my nonsense. And it's not nonsense, it's financial advice. But listen, if you can sit through a video, a 2 to 3 hour video about, fake Starship manufacturing companies, maybe you can use those same skills to research companies in real life. Find things that you're interested in, or things that you want to learn more about, or things that you know. Because building a portfolio, building your own financial future by acquiring assets is probably one of the best ways to shield you from all the bullshit that life throws in your way. Valuable lesson. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe. Hit that notification button down below so you don't miss on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.